Richard or something.
How much you scared me?
Well, you get down about me.
Somebody done beat him off after the stop.
I didn't see you.
We were running.
I had everything in there from the SMAC meeting. And they took it out.
Bluff, shit.
It was right behind these.
I blamed on that. I told him. Yeah.
It's 3:30. You want to start?
All right, yeah, we can start. I'd like to call the February 15th SMAC meeting to order. I'd like to thank all of you for coming, SMAC members and audience and staff. First order of business will be the approval of the agenda. Are there any changes or anything that needs to be added to the agenda by staff or by anyone in the audience or SMAC members?
Mr. Chairman. Andrew, yeah, we will be able to talk about the extension that I asked you for.
Yeah, I think I know
Okay.
other business, yeah.
I like to put it up for discussion anyway, yeah.
What will that be?
That's the extension on Pat season from March 1st to March 15th in Deep Rock.
All right.
And I'd like to add, Pat Gear's going to give a quick presentation about COVID relief funds after I give you a few introductory comments once you're ready to start.
Okay. All right, I need a, if everybody's satisfied with the change to the agenda, the addition of the patent hong and Mr. Stagg, do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
We have a motion by Mr. Kellum, second. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you. All right, we've approved the agenda. Mr. Stagg?
So I don't think y'all have met since we now have a Shellfish division. Most of you know it probably already, but Steve Bowman, before he left, with the cooperation of the Secretary of Natural Resource Office, did create a Shellfish division here, which basically combines the engineering surveying department, which had been in Habitat, with the Conservation Replenishment Department, which had been in Fisheries Division. So we are a standalone division. I was honored to be picked as the chief of the division. Andrew is the deputy chief, and our staff is basically made up of what was the engineering surveying department staff and the conservation replenishment staff, some of which are here today. So I just wanted to let y'all know that. I think a lot of you did know it already. We look forward to working with you with a little bit more focused one-stop shop for both the private leasing type activity and the public. They were already kind of intertwined to some degree. And so I just want to make that quick introduction.
I just need to unmute Dan there. Excuse me there for a minute. Oh, wait, you should be able to,
All right, so we probably had a call in. And I don't have a whole lot else to say. If anybody's got any quick questions, just you can ask them now, or I'm always available. I have the same phone number as I had before. I'm in the same place in the building. We are not together in the building exactly because we were on two different floors and wings, but we'll stay that way for now. But anyway, I hope this will help make things go a little bit smoother in the future with a coordinated division that kind of handles all the shellfish type activity under one sort of shop. So with that, turn it over to Pat, who's going to give you some money information.
Yeah, I didn't have the heart to kick this guy out of his office when he got any other division, so he's just still down the hallway from me, but it's like,
I think you're, you should be able to drive on that. Let's go down there. Why is it not?
it's right down here, isn't it?
Yeah, it was right on that.
What you did when you broke it?
Yeah, there we go. All right.
Okay. Y'all can see this okay? And okay. I think I mentioned this before. I'm trying to come to all our advisory committees and let you all know about disaster relief money we've been getting. There's been different pots of money. We're now in our third one, but we had, the first one was what was called the CARES Act, and I hope you all took advantage of that. That was March of 2000, right when the pandemic hit. We were like, Congress quickly got money out to the states, and we tried to distribute it as quickly as possible. So, just the numbers there, we had 868 applicants, 719 were qualified, and just about everybody received, everybody got the same size check. We wanted to try to get that money out as quickly as possible. And we completed that. And then last year, Congress passed what we call CARES 2. And it was the Congress passed the Consolidated Appropriation Acts, and we got $3.6 million. That time, what we decided to do is, instead of give everybody the same amount, we knew some people had much larger losses, so we were going to be basing it on your revenue losses. And I hope some of you applied. You had to provide information for the past 5 years. We took the average compared to 2020. You got your losses and you got money accordingly. So for that, we had 335 approved applications. We had $7.2 million in requests, but we only had about $3.6 million to give out. So everybody got about 50% of what they asked for. Payments range from $149 to almost $186,000. So I think our biggest request was a little over $2 million. So we capped that high amount. We made it, nobody could receive more than 10% of the total money we had. The average was about $11,000. We're done with both of those. We're really proud of the job we did, but now the USDA approached us and said, hey, now we got even more money that we want to give out. So this is from the USDA. It's for seafood processors, and it's called the Pandemic Response and Safety Block Grant Program. It's $50 million dedicated for seafood processors, at-sea processors, and dealers to defray expenses they had associated with COVID. So whereas before was for your revenue lost, this is for expenses you accrued according to deal with COVID. We're getting about $1.5 million to distribute, and we just got approved for that money last Friday, I think it was. So we're in the process of completing our application period. So when all's said and done, we've given out $8.17 million in assistance already to Virginia watermen, and with this will be $9.7 million. It's been a lot of work. I mean, when if they keep saying there may be another round, I'm like, not too crazy about taking this on again, but we've gotten good at it. We've gotten pretty good at it. The first round was a nightmare, trying to get everything up and running. But now we've kind of gotten this down. Our IT staff have been great developing online applications for it. So several agencies wanted this last one. The Marine Products Board was interested in this last one, so now we can do this. We've done it already. We'll take care of this one. So I wanted to just let you know a little bit about what's going on with that new one. Okay, why is it not moving forward? Oh, right down there. Okay, got it. All right, like I said, this is for expenses that you had. It's a little bit different, so we don't need tax records, we need receipts. Any receipts, and those receipts, it's in 6 categories. Workplace safety measures, did you buy people masks, gloves, sanitizer, plastic shields, those kind of things. The market pivots are things like, did you change how you marketed, how you sold your product? Did you deliver to people's houses? We know some of the crabbers were taking orders and delivering to people's houses. We know one seafood dealer was basically advertising on the local news every night. Those kind of things, advertising, those kind of things. Retrofitting your facility, what did you have to do to keep your business open and keep your employees working there? Transportation could be things like, did you have to transport staff? I mean, did you have to change your shipping methods, things like that? Worker housing, I didn't think that we would have too much in that category, but someone said no, folks were buying, for workers that they had, they were buying trailers to keep them on site. That would be an allowable expense. And medical, if you owned a company and you were sending people home because they were sick, you can and still paying them, that would be part of it as well. So for the most part, what we're telling you is that there's those 6 categories. We're going to have a process where you provide the applications, you tell us what category you think it came from, and we'll do all the math for you. So it's like, just save those receipts. We're trying to do this during tax season, so you don't have to do it twice. And like I said, it's for processors, at-sea processors, and dealers. the best way I could define it is you've had to modify the catch. So if you're a dealer and all you're doing is putting fish on ice, that's not going to count. But if you're cleaning or gutting or processing the fish or the product, making a product, that would count. If you're not sure, let us know and we can talk to you about it. Right now, we're still looking at the application period of March 1st through May 1st to coincide with tax season. So you should be getting your receipts together now anyway. We may extend that a little bit. We're in no hurry on this. We got 2 years to get this done, but we'd like to get it done this year. Like I said, receipts, invoices, tax records, whatever you have as far as those 6 items, how you spent that money. Now those receipts are going to have to be things like it's going to have the company's name, the date, how much, those things. You can't just like Joe's receipt to me. It's going to have to be it's going to have the legitimate information on it. We will have a meeting about this coming up. We'll do either a virtual meeting. We'll probably have a combination in-person and virtual meeting so we can get the word out. Our universe for this, the first round we did for disaster relief, our universe was about 3,300 commercial fishing licensmen, people. The second round was roughly about the same. This round is probably less than 230 people is what we're guessing. So our universe is getting smaller, but we're giving out more money probably because these people had the greatest losses. So just be aware it's coming. Let everyone know that there's another pot of money out there, and we'll be working through it. And we'll be pretty soon. We'll have the online application again. If you want to do an in-person application, that's fine. We'll probably have it set up so you can come in here and work with staff and try to get it done. So if there's any questions, I'll take them at this time. But just the main thing is just want to let you guys know so you can let the rest of the folks know this new money's coming down. It's mostly for processors. It's not for the fishermen who's just going out catching it and selling it to a dealer type of thing. So, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Gear. Any
Right.
questions for Mr. Gear before we move on?
All right, thank you.
I guess before we go any further, I'd like to get on record the members that are here today. So if we could start from my right.
Peyton Mason. Ernie George.
J.C. Hudgens.
Wayne France.
Cody Metcalf.
Blake Coward.
Ben Johnson.
Tom Keller.
Who do we have on the phone?
Diane Dowd.
Thank you, Dan.
Sam Leffert,
Thank you.
and Jackie Shannon.
Okay, and Jackie Shannon, yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, thanks a lot. All right, I guess we'll be moving on to the overview of the joint Bims Bmrc stock assessment survey. If that's what you're going to.
Yep. So I'll just give a brief overview, and there are some folks from Bims here. If there's any questions that I can address about the stock assessment survey, and this is a survey that is conducted annually by Bims and Bmrc. That really is kind of the backbone of our replenishment plan. So this is how we determine what areas are in need of shell based on that patent tong survey, and also sort of estimates of the condition and amount of the resource there. So I'll just kind of give I know we've done this before, but just as a refresher for some of the new members and folks here on a quick overview of what goes into the replenishment plan, and it starts with this survey. Is that showing up on your screen there? All right, Jamie? Okay. All right, so this is just a link that is to the publicly available Visara site there. If someone's on the call, we're getting a little bit of feedback. I'll move my mic away, but there we go. So if anyone wants, they can log in. This is where all the data from the patent tong survey and all the areas, close to 10,000 acres, that we survey is available to look at. That includes oyster densities, shell conditions, numbers of spat, small, live, all the stuff that we measure on the survey. So what I'm going to do is just sort of give a quick example of one oyster rock and sort of the process and how the survey of that one particular rock works. And this is what we do for all the areas that are surveyed under this joint program. So this is just a quick overview of the whole bay, and you can see all the familiar oyster reef names there: Hurley's, Johnson's, Onancock up in Tangier, and everything in the James River and York River. So these are all the areas, all the known named oyster rocks, roughly 10,000 acres that are surveyed each year over 3 months by Bims and Bmrc. So how we defined those areas or created that strata is based on either historical information, sort of where the actual footprint of the best part of Baylor ground, which is what you see there. See my laser pointer. So as we all know, everything in blue here isn't oyster rock, but in the example here, Polt's Bar and the Mobjack, this is the area that's sort of the best part of the historic rock, or an area that's had shell planting or historic replenishment in it. So those are the areas that we're surveying each year. We're not going out and just sort of randomly sampling this whole area. We're focusing on these known locations. That's not to say that along some edges right here, there might not be a few oysters on some shell, particularly in recent years as these areas have sort of come back outside of the replenishment spots. But for the most part, the best part of the rocks, or the areas that have had replenishment work, are what we're surveying here. So that's how we define the area or the strata that we're surveying. There's a highlight of what we're looking at, Polt's Bar, and how it actually works in terms of conducting the hydraulic patent survey. So we have a GIS program, and it generates a random grid. So basically, what's going on the computer side, which we used to do by hand, is each one of these grids on this reef is assigned a number, and a computer, or we used to just literally draw numbers out of the hat, would assign a number to that grid, and it corresponds with a GPS location, a lat and long. We do it computered now, and it generates the number of samples. So this program actually, each one of those spots corresponds with a piece on that reef that has a latitude and longitude. We have a sheet like this that we actually take out into the field on the boat, and we drive the boat to each one of these locations where we're taking a random sample using hydraulic pad tongs. There's the actual rig right there. So these aren't ordinary snap tongs. They're designed to be 1 square meter, and you can see they're considerably heavier than your ordinary oyster tongs, and they're really designed to get down underneath the whole part of the living reef, down into the mud, into the black shell underneath, and take a sample of everything that's in that one spot. That's then washed and sent to the back of the boat. And here you can see Bims and Bmrc staff hard at work counting and measuring every single oyster in that sample. All the live shell or brown shell or living oysters goes into these gray buckets right here, and we get an estimate of the actual shell volume. So the number of liters per patent tong grab is measured, and the number of live oysters are counted and measured, and that gives us the density of shell per square meter, the number of live oysters per square meter, and all the information that you see in all the graphics that you've seen at these SMAC meetings. Just for reference, one of those gray buckets is about 10 liters of shell. 10 liters of shell is about 12 millimeters or 1 shell thickness per square meter, and it corresponds roughly to about 1,000 bushels of shell per acre. So those are sort of rough estimates of what we're actually measuring, translated into bushels or thickness of shell on the bottom. So again, that's what we have when we're actually out there, that's generated from that sample. And that sample is statistically, the number of samples that we take is designed so that in layman's terms, if we kept on sampling, if we took, say, 100 samples, the average wouldn't be any better by taking 100 samples or 1,000 samples, that we take the number of samples needed so that our standard error isn't getting any smaller. So if we kept on sampling, we wouldn't get any better data. We could keep on taking more and more grabs, and our error might decrease a little bit, but more samples and more areas, if we did the whole reef based on number of samples and the area surveyed, more samples doesn't get you better information. So if you have a good strata and you take the right number of samples, it's a statistically sound method of estimating the volume of what you're looking at on the reef. So more samples just means a lot more oysters to count. We're not actually getting a better idea of what's there. Yeah.
Would you need to take more samples on a much larger area, or is it about the same everywhere?
The number of samples is calibrated by area, so larger areas, that area is 14 acres, might have 3-7 samples like that, but a larger 600,000 acre area, we might have 70 or 80 samples. We've recently done some above my level statistic analysis going back through our survey data and used 20 years of data basically to calibrate our survey for more efficiency, and we found that there were some areas where we could sample less, and there were some areas that we sampled more. So we recently, 2-3 years ago did that, and then we've used that data compared it to historical data to make sure that everything is as it should be. And there are some cases where if something is an anomaly, if it doesn't match, we go back and add more samples. You do get into situations where if something changed unexpected, say a boat ran through the middle of the reef and there was a big hole in it, then that might show up on the survey and we'd say, oh, we'd want to take some more samples. But if everything is historically as it has been, we're sort of sampling the right number, that more samples doesn't really make things more accurate.
Thank you.
Andrew, I got a question. So being a patent tone harvester, I'm probably not going to see the numbers that you see, correct? Because of the type of tones you're using, the power tones, they're heavier, you got more teeth, they're longer teeth. So if you come up with 8 or 10 oysters per meter on deep rock, I'm not going to see that when I go there because I'm using 100-pound tone, wide teeth, So just want to make it clear to everybody that numbers you come up with probably aren't going to be what we're going to see here down the rock. If we work in the same area that you survey, right? Would you agree with that?
Well, these are the ones that you all see are going to be an average, so it'll be all the 10 grabs together. So we might have a grab that had 20, we might have a grab that had 0. So if we do get those zeros, those are all included in that total average. We might have one that had 5. But you're probably right that in most cases ours are going to be more efficient than the snap tongs, unless you're really getting up to
you're
dig.
catching everything. You're catching all the bottom. You're getting actually under it. Where we, a lot of places, and Ernie can tell you too. I mean, they are deep rock. A lot of places you just can't get into them, with the tongs that we have. So, okay. I was just wondering, comparing the numbers,
Yep. No, you would definitely see that difference. But yeah. I mean, so if they're right up on the surface, but if there's anything buried down in there, we're definitely going to get probably more per square meter than just about anything. So all that information, again, is we track that by year, and then this is just Pulse bar that we're looking at right now. So you have your average spat, average small, average market, average brown shell volume, and again, this is the average across all of the samples that we took in that year. So that's not every single sample had 25 smalls, but on average, all 10 did. So you add all the samples together, you divide by the number of samples, that gets you your average. So that's what we do in simple terms for each one of the reefs that we survey over close to that 10,000 acres, and that's what goes into the plan that we're looking at today, as well as establishing the seasons there. And again, that gives us all sorts of information. So, I mean, we have minimum depth, maximum depth, and all that stuff you can throw out into a nice chart. This one I wanted to leave up there, but this is sort of how you can convert those density numbers into bushels of shell or bushels of oysters. And I sent this all out by email to the folks here on the committee as well. But this is how you can convert those densities, and the graphs basically look the same. So you can take areas and you can switch from meters squared to bushels, and it'll basically follows the same trends. It's just whatever metric you want to use, and it's pretty straightforward to do all that. So this is what we use if we're converting back and forth between liters, meters to bushels. And again, something that we talk about on this is that 5 oysters per meter is generally an area that could support patent tongs, and 10 oysters per square meter with shallow enough water is generally an area that could support hand tongs. And 5 liters of shell volume is basically half the whole area is covered in shell, and that's when we see the potential for a spat set there, basically below that, and it's hard for there to be physically room for spat to attach. And at 10 liters, the whole area is covered more or less on average with a living layer of shell, and that's why it's sort of those 5 and 10 numbers are sort of important to pay attention when going through the rest of the replenishment plan. And again, that's the whole area. And if there's any other questions on the survey, I'd be glad to try to address them or refer them to the folks at Bims.
Just a note, Andrew, it's what, 5 or 6 boats, I think, working Portsmouth now, right?
I heard 5, 6 on the first week, and
Yeah.
then maybe twice that now. I'm not sure. I haven't gotten a report from this week, but
I got
they've
it.
been doing, and
Yeah,
Pulse
they've
is
been
monitoring.
doing pretty good there, yeah, I'm surprised.
Mhm.
So when we moved those shells, did we move any from Portsmouth?
That was where the majority of them
It
came
was?
from, was
Okay.
Pulse Bar. Yeah.
So this was the outer perimeter, so to speak?
Yeah, well, we didn't work that whole area. We tried to kind of stop
Leave
it
some.
before we got down into just black shell and mud, so we did leave some there. And again, probably those outside edges. Those were the areas that were still good when we started moving it. We probably didn't get into all those spots.
Gotcha. Okay.
Any questions from the audience? I don't see any, so whenever you're ready to proceed, Andrew.
All right. Any questions on the phone there?
No.
Okay. All right. Now, I can break this up. Feel free to jump in with questions or comments or input, but I'm going to run through, and if there's, I emailed them out, but there's more copies of the written version of this. So I'll just run down some of the quick background on this, and a lot of it's repetitive for folks who have been here a while, but it sort of sets the pace for the rest of the plan. And again, as I said, if there's any questions, feel free to jump in, and we don't have to take everything all at the end. We can sort of take it item by item if it's works better that way. So this will be presented to the commission at the upcoming meeting next week with any input and advice from SMAC incorporated in it. So this is a draft document that we can change tomorrow and the next day and sort of present to the commission with input. So this isn't the final plan. It's an outline of what's proposed that I'd like to have the input of SMAC on and then take to the commission for approval next week. Start with a little bit of good news is, as many folks saw last year, the COVID-19 pandemic that has been much in the news and is still sort of percolating there, really did have a noticeable impact in the numbers of oysters harvested last year. We saw almost 100,000 bushel decrease on public and private ground sort of in that last season, and a lot of that was not related to the number of oysters available. It was really market driven. The good news is sort of with the preliminary data coming in, we're really getting back to pre-pandemic levels of oyster harvest. So we're seeing, getting up in that 2021 calendar year back up to over 500,000 bushels on both public and private ground. Again, we'll have better numbers on the public harvest season, but it looks like we're sort of back into that long-term historic average of about 250,000 bushels coming off of public ground, which is the long-term average if you go all the way back to the 1957-1958 season. But what we're looking at here is traditional harvest on both public and or on private ground, as well as containerized or aquaculture. And this is that first graph that I showed you is just private and public. This one sort of gives you a little bit more detailed breakdown of where oysters are coming from. The brown down at the bottom, again, this is calendar year, not seasons, a little bit different, is what shows up in our reporting as containerized aquaculture, so cages, floats, what many people think of when they think of aquaculture. What you're seeing in this yellow section here is traditional harvest off of private ground. So this is harvest that's reported primarily with dredges and scrapes. And this does include, which Bmrc doesn't capture, spat-on shell planting, but that probably is maybe in the 40 to 60,000 bushel range on a good year of spat-on shell planting, and the rest of that traditional wild harvest from private ground is coming through natural shell planting, seed transport, that sort of thing. So that's that, and then the gray up here is the sum of the public ground harvest, which is, as we all know, caught primarily with traditional gear. This is just a snapshot of a single calendar year with, again, the wild private or traditional private in gray, all of public here, and then the sum of that containerized aquaculture. And this is about a 47%, 33%, and about 20% there left over if I did the quick math on that right. But the breakdown for that. And that's kind of been about the range for the last 5 years or so. It's been about a 40-40-20 split, give or take, depending on the year, with that containerized portion being one of the areas that's been increasing the quickest, but all of these areas have been going up together. And as we all know, a lot of the factors that influence the containerized fishery or the private traditional fishery, the public fishery, the same. So that's water quality, spat sets. So if there's a water quality issues, the hatcheries aren't producing, and if there's water quality issues, the natural oysters aren't producing, and again, that sort of follows through. So they tend to track up and down together, and have done so for a very long time in Virginia. Again, I'll stick with good news for a while. As this is 2021 patent tongue, that survey that we went over in beginning data, and what we're seeing right now on a bay-wide average. So this is all areas all over the bay that we survey, is we're really at an impressive place right now. We're at the highest level of market oysters on average across the whole bay that we've been in this close to 20-year history of this survey. So we're actually on a bay-wide average above 10 market oysters per square meter right now. And again, the spat sets have gone down a little bit the last 2 years, but we're still sort of at that, I would say, historic average higher level. And the number of small oysters, again, is right up there. And the shell volume we're in better shape in terms of the amount of shell on the bottom right now than we have been. Again, just because we're in better shape doesn't mean that it can't go the other way relatively quickly. This is after increased replenishment efforts, after the COVID pandemic took a lot of that demand off, as well as the spat sets that we had in previous years. So all of that is coming right now, is showing up in the survey. So we're seeing all those efforts combined into the oyster resource being in pretty good shape. Again, this is one of the graphs that you've seen before, but this is the average shell volume across the entire bay on the bottom in liters, and this is the average spat set, or the spat set for each reef in the 2021 calendar year. And you can see that below 5 liters, you're getting some spat, but really that arrow right there is 100 spat per square meter. So you're really not getting a lot. Once you get over 5, you start getting pretty good spat sets. And once you get over that 10-liter threshold where you have a full layer of shell available, there's physically enough room that you can really start getting high spat sets. And at that point, you can start getting 600 or 1,000 spat per square meter if you're really getting a good set. So there's physically just enough room to fully take advantage of that spat set. And that's something that in the past, if we do get an area with that high strike, we've been able to take advantage of by moving seed, like we've done in the James River or in the Mob Jack. And that helps provide a buffer if there's something like 2018 where you see these areas die off or you get poor recruitment in some areas. So by continuing this large-scale bay-wide replenishment, it's sort of a buffer against the changing climate that we're seeing with these increased rain events and that sort of thing. So it's good to sort of hedge our bets and keep things as healthy as we can in as many places as we can. Again, the average shell volume, there's that yellow line at 5 liters, and this is bay-wide, and there's that 10. And again, in most areas across the entire bay, we're getting close, which is a good place to be. So that's a quick overview of sort of where the whole resource stands based on our survey data. Were there any questions on that before we got into the dollars and cents portion?
Any questions?
All right. See, I'm staying on track here. Okay, so these are similar funding levels to last year, and I wanted to make a couple of notes. The general funds, we anticipate those being the same as previous years, so $2.5 million available for harvest areas, replenishment areas, and then $1.5 million is what's currently in the budget for restoration funding. I know we discussed capital funding last year when we had that $10 million amount. There's about $5 million in that left that we plan on using this year. The Nature Conservancy will likely have about $125,000. And then on this one here, we're planning on pursuing a number of grants for restoration work in some areas, and we're not 100% certain on when the timing of that will come into place, but these will be what we're looking to pursue, sort of in this range, and we're going to go ahead and try to get those areas permitted. And again, if as we always have tried to do and will do this year, any restoration projects or sanctuary areas, we try to construct those in non-controversial areas where there's not going to be issues with it. And we try to, whenever possible, include projects that are going to have a benefit to both the public fishery and location, as well as trying to decrease mobilization costs and learn from the restoration side of things what can work in the public fishery. So whenever possible, we try to either lower the per unit cost by combining restoration and replenishment projects, or look to benefit all aspects of the fishery. And that's one of those things. In the past, we used to have sort of one set of funding that we could use for either or, but right now we've split it up in budget language to have sort of these separate pots of funding, but both pots that we take from, we try to have benefits to the others. There's still some NOAA grant funding available. Again, we're not 100% certain on the timing of this, but that's likely the range in the $700,000 to $2.8 million range. And a lot of this is coming out of these recovery acts that's specific for resiliency or specifically to restoration. But again, we're working whenever possible to leverage co-benefits for public fishery side of things as well. Were there any questions? Yep.
Are the TNC funds Yankee Tank specific, or?
They have been in the past, but these are this year primarily Eastern Shore Seaside specific. So the Seaside Coastal Reserve has some specific funding set aside for projects over there.
Andrew, the 4 to 6 million under capital funds restoration, is that what was left over from the 10 last year?
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah.
So, if we look at the numbers, general funds, we're looking at about $3 million. Is that what you're looking at to work with for the public fishery?
About for the 2.5. 2.5, yeah.
The general fund and a half to 1 million in the grants, non-general?
Yep.
Would that be included?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And on the restoration side, we've got $1.5 million for, say, 5, 6.5, about 6.5 million. Does that have $1 million to work with there?
That's correct. Yep, about that. There's in that range.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. I mean, it's a lot of money, you know, and I'm grateful for what we get in the public fishery, you know. I mean, and I've been well-spoken on this. I think I'd really like to see the public fishery receive a little more on that side of it, you know. I guess the question I have for you is, how does the state benefit economically from the restoration side of this program? We can take a piece of public rock, we can go in there, and we can estimate how many oysters we got on this rock. We can go work it as fishermen, harvesters, and we can come up with an economic benefit to the state of Virginia that's probably 7 times what we put into it. So I was just wondering, how do we substantiate this kind of money being spent on the restoration side?
Well, I guess the short answer is it's a lot more complicated to do that than just you put in $2 million and you get $28 million worth of harvest out of it.
Right.
But there's been extensive papers written on it, but the short answer that I can give that without getting into a 45-minute dissertation on the benefits of restoration is the sort of direct benefit to the fishery is we're, as an agency, able, this is a lot more work for the agency, so this isn't taking away anything from the public fishery. But what it is allowing us to do is we can, as I said, try to lower. So if we're doing a restoration project with Shell, for example, if we have a contract for 1,000 shells, we might be paying $2 a bushel. But if we have a contract for 10,000 shells, we might be paying $1.50 a bushel. So you're getting potentially more out of that $2 million by including some projects on the restoration side. The other aspect is we can recover some of the cost to run the replenishment program. So we can take some indirect cost, and that can pay for boats, it can pay for fuel, it can pay for the program that would normally be coming out of, I mean, it's the same amount of work to survey these areas for the most part, would be coming out of those replenishment funds that are focused on maintaining the fishery. So there are some benefits, but it's not as quantifiable as just the dollars and cents. And the habitat restoration side, there's been lots of work done in terms of this provides fish habitat that helps the commercial fisheries, provides crab habitat. If you want to get into nutrient credit trading, that's a whole nother story, but they can add millions pretty quick in terms of the ecological value of these restoration sites. But it's not a simple,
Right.
not nearly as simple as a 7-to-1 of $28 million of harvest for $2 million of replenishment there.
But you'll agree, if we had more money for more shells on the public rocks, we would have more oysters, right? Providing everything
yeah.
else falls in place.
Yep, no, more
Yeah.
substrate. And the other thing is we'd
Okay.
have more options in terms of alternative substrate there. So the one thing that we don't have is an unlimited supply of shell.
Right.
So we're at a pretty good level where we're maintaining the size of the fishery and the oysters are going up. But if we had more money, we don't necessarily just want to put more shell everywhere all at once. We kind of want to have a little bit of that reserve likely. But it would allow us more flexibility if there's more specific funding that we could do some more stone planting in the Piankatank or in the Rappahannock or other areas and look at some of this replenishment effort beyond the traditional shell planting. So there's definitely benefits. I try to never say no to more money, but it's one of those, I think, where how it was spent would have definitely short-term benefits, but if we spent too much too quickly, we could run out of shell quicker too.
Okay.
The user fee money, is that in the top line general funds or?
That's in this non-general funds replenishment included in there. So there's some other grant funding that would be non-general funds, and we usually in that $100,000 to $200,000 range of the user fee money is what we typically use for a lot of the seed transport each year. Yeah, as well as some additional shell planting if needed.
And what's normally the user fee total aggregate? That 150 to 200 is normally what you?
That's normally what's gone directly to the seed transplanting each year.
I didn't ask you correct. What's the total amount of user fee roundabout that?
We get in that 460,000 to about range each year. About $500,000 in user fees come in, give or take, depending on the year. And a lot of that does go into programming support, and we have let that build up a little bit. But again, if something happened on The general fund side, we kind of like to have that as a reserve so we can still have a program. So we do try to keep a pretty good running balance
I
in there.
guess that's where I was going with that, is what, what would we have if the general fund ever went away? Which
Right.
we've seen in the past.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's one of those, I think right now, I don't have a number offhand, but we have probably about close to $1 million in there right now. But, so we'd have a much smaller program than this if the general fund did go away, but we'd have some programs still.
Andrew, does any of the user fund money go to the Marine Products Board, or is that just license fees?
That's not any of these user fee, that's the
It's license
fisheries
fee.
license
Okay.
thing, yeah.
Didn't know if that was included or not.
Are there any other questions on the funding side? That's the, all right.
Guess we can go ahead.
So this is gonna be, the seed transfer section, and this is, I really like some input from the group on this. I guess there's a couple questions, and the real, I'll just go ahead and run through it there. So what we have proposed right now is primarily that area in the lower James River, the Nansman Ridge, that we've continuously shelled with the fossil shell and have transported about 20,000 bushels to places in the Rappahannock, the Upper Pocomoke, and some of the Potomac tributaries. And, we'd had a seed transfer program in the Great Wacomico and Piankatank in years past. Sort of the two shells would be planted, and private industry was allowed to catch with dredges, a certain number of bushels per year in these areas. Now as part of the replenishment plan. And these areas, we haven't done that for about 3 years now, and they are, close to recovered. They haven't had a great spat set the last 2 years. Some of them have had, they're in better shape than they were, but there are some larger oysters here now. And in the Great Wacomico, last year we moved about 4,000 or 5,000 bushels to the harvest areas. That's an option for this year. I definitely would be in support of doing the James River seed if SMAC advises that and the commission approves it. But the question that I wanted to throw out, we don't have to make a decision on it at this point, would be to look at the Great Wacomico and Piankatank together and sort of change the management approach. And some of the options that have been kicked around are having a quota managed either seed fishery or market fishery, sort of similar to the James River. So have a permit process in place, have a very controlled harvest of these areas, and allow either seed transport to private ground, primarily using probably shaft tongs to start out with, or have a limited market harvest. Again, a true quota managed season that we'd work with our scientific advisors on establishing in these areas. So there's specific reefs that have been maintained as seed reefs. In some years, the 2-for-1 shell program worked pretty well. There was some pushback about it was hard to get into if you basically didn't have a shell pile that you could work. But again, sort of changing the management strategy so that it was more of a public access area and more people could benefit from it. And I guess the question is if we move seed as a state out of these areas, that sort of limits your options next year for that, because we've taken 5,000 bushels out. So I just wanted to throw that out for discussion to see what SMAC thinks about potentially maybe as soon as the next season looking at changing the management system in these areas to allow more of a public fishery. Again, a quota managed in specific areas, public fishery in some of these areas that have been traditional seed areas in the Piankatank and the Great Wacomico.
Talking about a public fishery for markets or a public fishery for seed?
Well, I think it could be either or at this point. I mean, there's some areas that you could do a tightly managed quota system for market oysters. I mean, there are marketable oysters there, and there's some areas that may be more appropriate as seed areas, and we could potentially do either or both.
And if you did open it for markets, you'd still be leaving the seed.
Right.
Suppose?
Right. So it would be one of those is we could look at that and have a true quota system similar to where they do in Delaware Bay, where you have, this is what you can catch. You're calling it in daily. So we have it's not sort of open like all these other areas where we're not entirely sure the harvest is going to go on in a month. So have a tighter control on that. So it would be an option that we could look at in these
And then
areas.
if you did open something like that for the public fishery and markets, would that be hand-tone?
I think that's what we'd probably recommend at first. I mean, there would be ways that we could look at it, but that would probably be the safest sort of approach initially there. I mean, these areas are pretty small, and they could get, you know, especially with a public fishery there, they could get beat up pretty quickly. So that'd probably be the most cautionary approach on it first.
I think in the past, Andrew, what I seen that came off of there, it was a fair amount of market oysters in the seed. Don't know what the ratio was, but it was pretty good in some places. So you could expect to have you know, a fair amount of market oysters there.
I think that is what we're seeing, and I mean it's sort of on that range where it's probably almost too many market oysters to be true seed, but again, it's not completely wrapped up, particularly since it hasn't been worked in close to 3 years. But some areas, again, maybe better for seed, and some areas better for market.
And I agree with you somewhat on the hand-tone, starting out with that, but I don't think you're gonna get much participation in it, you know. What do you think, Ernie?
So do my league.
Well, I'm just happy to talk about it. I mean, something that's very weather, where you can get out the weather, you know, it's a good river for that. And at one time, it was a very good hand-tone river. So, but just happy to see you do something on that side of it.
Do you expect the, excuse me,
Please.
do you expect the Pianka tank to be structured the same way as the James River, where you can clean cull it and seed it in the same time, just depending on who's willing to buy what product?
I think that could be an option, but again, I think that's something that we might want to decide on now in terms of not moving seed with dredges to public areas. Then we can have sort of more meetings and more discussions, but that would be sort of, I don't want to say all options on the table, but that would be something we could look at, is sort of a mini James River, again, but probably more tightly controlled in terms of reef by reef rather than just a whole line and this is seed or clean cull kind of thing.
Oh, okay, so you're just looking to shift the Pianka tank from harvesting with the private program, where 2-for-1, to a public fishery, so anybody can harvest it. Would it be able to go out of state, or would the seed be able to go out of state, or would it have to stay within Virginia?
Again, those are questions that we could discuss once we establish the season, but I think that would be an option. We could basically, at this point, the commission could come up with whatever program within certain parameters that we'd like. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Let's go.
Andrew, on the Great Wacomico, you sort of thinking from maybe Haney's Bar, how far upriver would?
I'll go to the map there, and then we'll go back. But probably primarily Haney Bar, Shell Bar, and Sandy Point would probably be the areas. So
Essentially where you were doing the public-private.
right. And again, none of the officially designated sanctuary reefs, basically only the reefs that have been part of that seed program. So I mean, I guess the question is, do we want to wait on potentially moving seed from the Great Wacomico this year? I think the Pianka tank, at this point, we probably wouldn't recommend moving seed to out of there. But I think the decision point for this meeting would be whether we should just do that 20,000 bushels probably from the James River, or move that 5,000 bushels potentially to, as we did to the hand scrape areas. And I think I did speak, I know he's not here today, with Rich Harding there, and he was in favor of this program in terms of not holding off on moving some seed out of these areas to further explore in the future there.
Yeah.
In the hand scrape areas, correct me if I'm wrong, they look pretty good in stock assessment as they are.
That's correct. I mean, we did move some seed down there, and they had again, almost everywhere has looked better than it has in a number of years there, including these areas.
So this is something we can have further discussion on, besides making a decision today.
Yeah, well, I think the decision today would be, if we don't want to have this seed program as part of the replenishment plan, then we can pull that 5,000 bushels out of the Great Wacomico and just say we're going to explore other options for it, rather than if particularly if the advisory committee is in favor of that, I think staff would support holding off on that as well.
Just roughly, Andrew, any estimates on amount of seed in these particular bars?
I think in that 5,000 to 10,000 bushel range would probably be in the comfort zone. Again, we'd want to look at the survey data and sort of make a good assessment, but 10,000 bushels was what we were taking out of on the 2-for-1 program out of this area. So
And the James River to 20,000, you're pretty firm with that, right?
I think that would be a pretty reasonable amount, maybe a little bit more depending on how it holds up, but about 20,000 is what we've been doing.
Andrew, in looking in particular at the Great Common and the program that the Corps of Engineers was involved in some years ago, does that limit the options that the state of Virginia has in the area that they spend money?
Yeah, these areas wouldn't be any of the coral reefs, but yes, we would not be doing any projects, any seed removal on those projects that were funded with core money. We do get credit for maintaining through our quota fishery towards other core projects. So these count towards those restoration goals now, and that's why we would have somewhat limited options in terms of it would have to be that a tighter management system than we would have in other public areas. Would be a limitation if we wanted to continue to count these towards those restoration goals.
So how is the core money, how is that structured when the Corps spends money on these different areas? Is it done by a public ground number, or how is it done?
In terms of,
Well, when they went on, they put, they put shell down, and they put rocks on top of shells. How did they structure those areas? Did the state basically set those areas aside for core projects in the future? Or how are we limited in what we can do?
those areas were permitted, I guess, by VMRC, and there were agreements when they were made and sort of what their permitted use was. So in theory, VMRC, the whole board could change that, but I think there's pretty firm agreements in place that if it's a federal project, VMRC as a non-federal sponsor has to help maintain that. So we're somewhat limited in terms of these areas. But outside of the core projects and these seed areas, we have less limitations.
Did they do this on Piankatank as well, or just Great Common?
There are some areas in the Piankatank that would be limited, but not, again, in the Piankatank, we'd be working on the traditional seed harvest areas that have been part of that program. So those areas don't have the same limitations as the areas that have had stone and rock placed on them there. So there's pure sanctuary, and then there's seed areas that are managed in the Piankatank and the Great Wacomico, and there's sort of public fishery areas, and those are sort of, if you want to call it, sort of the 3 tiers that we have. And we have less flexibility on the designated sanctuaries, a little bit more on the seed, and the public fisheries areas are where we normally have our harvest seasons.
Any other questions?
I have a quick one. So if we decide not to remove seed from the Great Wacomico, does that mean we would remove more seed from the James River? So it's an either-or decision?
I think at this point, we might do a little bit more depending on that final budget number, but we'd probably just not move that 5,000 bushels down to the harvest areas in Great Wacomico. So it'd probably be about the same level of seed coming from Nansemond Ridge and the James River, maybe a little bit more if the funding worked out and the resource held up down there. Yeah.
So, and James River can sustain more seed removed from it?
This is the area we're talking about, the James River. It's not the seed area. Let me go back.
Right,
to it.
Nansemond Ridge.
Yep, the
I
Nansemond Ridge
understand.
area. Yep.
But in the previous slide, it said 20,000 bushels. It can sustain more than 20,000 bushels being removed from it?
That's about an estimate of what we think we could do. We could probably do a little bit more. It's a little bit more of a budget constraint too. Okay. So we'll kind of see in that range. It might be 24,000. It might be 18,000. We want to make sure we're not completely wiping out that area that was planted for it. But
Okay.
There'd be more funding available if it's still held up to maybe move a little bit more seed from the Nansemond Ridge if we didn't do that Great Wacomico project.
Mr. Johnson?
With the situation of James River that was discussed at the commission meeting last month, how can you justify taking 20,000 bushels out of a harvest area in James River that isn't a set-aside seed area? Yes, it was a shell plant, but that shell plant was on and in a hand scrape harvest area? Why wouldn't you use a resource like Deepwater Light that has been set aside for years as a seed transfer area and leave a harvest area to be handled as a harvest area?
Well, I guess the Deepwater Light areas generally have a much softer bottom, and we can't replenish those areas with shell as easily. That's why that hand tong line is there. Most of those areas are very shallow and hard to get a boat to. So we have done in the past seed programs where these areas where we were purchasing seed from hand tong areas and moving those. But the reason we switched to the Nansman Ridge area was we could get more seed moved for a lower cost to better help the entire fishery. And these areas were maintained specifically for that after we had that high spat set. And the Nansman Ridge area and the area below the James River Bridge had significantly higher market-sized oyster populations, and we didn't see some of those same numbers that we saw in those upriver areas in the James.
And to my point there, that's an area that was asked to be extended and opened, and it was said by staff it couldn't sustain any more harvest than being shut down at the end of January. But now we're mentioning taking 20,000 more bushels of, nobody's culling it, it's drudged by, it's markets, it's smalls, it's shells, it's the whole 9 yards, and majority of, anyway, after that discussion, I can't support that idea.
Andrew, another question on James River. We up until 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
Could you just lean into your mic there a little bit so we can make sure?
Up
we
until
hear
about
you?
3 or 4 years ago, we let the watermen catch the oysters. They were bought. It was a higher cost planted, but you probably had a cleaner resource. It came off these soft areas that can't be dredged. Now we're moving down the river. We're dredging with big dredges. We're cleaning the bottom up. We're moving the oysters plus the shells are there. Are you seeing recovery on the oysters that are moved more economically, or did you see better recovery on the oysters that were moved less economically as far as the cost per bushel planted?
I think, let me see if I can phrase what you're saying. Are you saying that?
So I'm saying the watermen caught the oysters, they were sold to a private individual, and then they were planted by private individuals. And we're certainly not angling to plant the oysters. We've got plenty to plant ourselves. But overall, what Bim's saying is this is an area that the watermen wanted to dredge for 2 more weeks or a month, and they're not being allowed to dredge. They weren't allowed to dredge because the quantity of oysters were not there. So now we're saying we're going to go in that area and move the oysters to other parts of the state, and the oysters are available.
Well,
So why wouldn't you go back and look at the areas where oysters are more available and let them be hand-toned by the waterman and sold and planted by somebody in the state of Virginia, even if they went on a buy boat and let them were planted?
well, I guess to respond to that, if I could, Mr. Chairman, I guess in this case, we would know exactly how many oysters are coming off of these areas. Staff would be on site there to know that this is the amount that's coming off of there. And in terms of the decision that was made about the James River, it was made, I believe, and I don't want to speak for the commission, but the staff recommendation and the staff's concern at the time was that we don't know how much harvest would come out of these areas. Not that there was no resource there. I don't think anyone said that there was no oysters there, but it's a possibility that, you know, that more oysters than needed to come out of those areas could, or we wouldn't know.
But you have a lot more seed oysters up the river that are probably not going to grow to market size. And that resource, I thought, did relatively well in the areas that it was being planted on if the oysters were caught to the state standard of so many liters of shell per bushel.
Well, I mean, I think if the committee would like us to try to put that program out again, that's something that we can do. Again, it's likely we'd get less bushels for a higher price. I'm not sure what that price would be, but that's when we went to this, is we couldn't get anyone to agree on the price that was advertised, so we switched to this program to allow the seed program to continue.
But don't you have adequate funding for, in the general fund funding to do repletion work this year?
Well, yes, we do. So if we did more seed for more, or less seed for more money, then that would likely mean less seed. And depending on if we did the same amount of seed for more money, that would mean less shell in these other areas. So we have a fixed amount of funding for all of this. So if we take from, if this program gets bigger, we're taking from somewhere else. So we're likely planning less shell.
Back to Mr. Calvert's point, my point in the beginning, we're taking seed from a harvest area. We're not taking seed from a seed area. The state has designated seed areas, Deep Water Light, Point of Shoals. And to go to what you said about the state not sure what amount of oysters, the biggest ask that was made at this commission meeting was for 17,000 bushels. If, and I'm not gonna go too far into the numbers, if everybody that could work did work, every day they could work out of the whole river, and now we're gonna take 20,000 plus bushels out of, what is that, 50 acres, 40 acres?
Yeah, it's about 40 acres or so.
It just,
You know what kind of count is on that area?
These are in the 800 or so to potentially a little bit more than that, 1,200, I would say.
and from the people that were working when the season closed, there is as it stands today, a tremendous amount of market oysters in that area right now.
I have the numbers right here. So this is the areas that were specifically planted, that sort of 40 acres there for seed. So that was approved by the committee in this committee and the commission in last year's replenishment plan was to shell those areas specifically for this seed program. And the entire Nansman Ridge, which is many, many more acres, over 200 acres, also has a very high density of market oysters. And again, to go to this map, this would be areas right here, and this entire area as seeing a very good number of oysters. So that I would be glad to take that to the commission in terms of an SMAC recommendation if that is to either not do this or look at a different seed program, or if the committee would rather have shell and no seed. I mean, these areas are all in pretty good shape. So, you know, I'm open to suggestions on this and would be glad to provide an SMAC recommendation on it if it does differ from staff.
I'm not suggesting either way. I'm asking the question, are we better off to move out of the seed areas to other areas of the state of Virginia, i.e. Nominate, wherever you might want to go in a fresher area, and leave the larger oysters for direct market in the Lower James River? I know you got more cost because you need to hand thaw them.
Mm-hmm.
But then, is the less cost correlating into more market oysters across the state of Virginia than the more cost option? The less cost being dredging by large boats that can't do that on these soft areas
Mm-hmm.
versus dredging down the river and moving the seed and planting it. That's my question.
Well, that's a hard, I don't know if there's a way of answering that specific question. I mean, you're going to get more market oysters by moving seed, so we know that. Whether you're going to get more market oysters harvested by not moving this seed, probably not, because the limiting factor in the Lower James River isn't the number of market oysters, it's the length of the season. So I think the same number of market oysters are going to come out of the James River depending on the season length, regardless of whether we move seed from this particular area.
What is approximately the difference in cost from dredging the oysters here on Nansman Ridge would be from buying from people harvesting oysters up the river on the seed areas?
That might be a question the committee can answer. I'm not sure if there's anyone who's been transporting seed oysters and planting them in the Potomac or upper areas that might have a better estimate on that. But I can tell you on the seed dredge area, we were moving them to various areas in the state in that $6 to $7.50 per bushel range, I think low sevens. And then on the market oysters, we were moving them to areas that were $2 to $3 per bushel range. So I think the same number of market oysters are going to come out of the James River depending on the season length, regardless of whether we move seed from this particular area.
What is approximately the difference in cost from dredging the oysters here on Nansman Ridge would be from buying from people harvesting oysters up the river on the seed areas?
last year, depending on distance and size of boat, but that was sort of the range. On the far side of it, went all the way up to the Potomac in that $7 a bushel range, whereas we couldn't get anyone, I think 5 years ago, to do the hand tong seed. I think the lowest offer we got was sort of in the $12 a bushel range, and it may well be higher now, and that was the overboard cost. I think, I'm not sure if anyone has a going rate for at the dock, but sort of $4 or $5, $6 a bushel.
Probably about 6.
I can tell you what the Potomac paid. Yeah, it's gonna be $12 delivery, you know.
Would you agree that there's a difference in James River shaft tong seed as far as count and the ability that the long-term effect of planting that bushel versus planting a bushel off of Nansman Ridge, which already has market oysters in it?
It really depends on probably the individual reef that they went to and the count. So, I mean, if you're getting a similar count, it's probably a similar product. Again, some of those upriver areas are well suited to lower salinity areas, and the advantage that the Nansman Ridge area has is this is a slightly higher salinity area, so we have more options in terms of where that seed can be transported to, and it'll likely do better, have more disease resistance. So the upriver areas have traditionally been planted in low salinity areas where there's low impacts from MSX and Dermo. But the other advantage that these lower James River areas have is these oysters likely have some Dermo and MSX resistance already. So it's a sort of a more versatile product in terms of where it can go. And that's why we've been able to take these to areas in the Tangier Sound and parts of the Rappahannock and upper Pocomoke, as well as to those areas in the Potomac tributaries. So it depends on where they're going, I guess, is the answer.
All right, Andrew. So if we don't take this 20,000 bushels off of this area here, we don't have anywhere else that we can do this if we elect not to use this particular ground. I agree with Mr. Johnson that you know, I hate to take market size oysters for seed oysters, you know, in light of the fact that it is a, you know, a very popular drudging area. I guess the 20,000 bushels that you originally going to take all this, you were going to looking at 7 and 8 in the Rappahannock and some in the Yokomoco and the Cone up there. Is that where you were looking at taking most of it?
Yeah, probably. If the advisory committee would like to, maybe a load or two over to the Pocomoke, that upper area, we've been putting some seed there. About 5,000 bushels in Potomac tribs, and those about 10,000 or so bushels has been going to the upper Rappahannock here recently. And those areas have been holding up pretty well. Additionally, with the spat set and that seed that's been going up there for 3 years now.
Did we put the 20,000 bushels there earmarked to come back off of it? Is that correct? You put shell there to
More
set it up?
than yeah. There was I don't have the numbers on hand, but there was a significant amount of shell, probably closer to 40 or 50,000 bushels put back there in these areas, and they were expanded basically to keep this program as an option.
Do you know what year that was, or have you been doing it every year?
Every year.
Andrew, how long have we been taking oysters from this area? For this seed program?
And for the seed program, this would be the fourth year, is that right? Yeah, 4 years. This would be the fourth year.
And I'm sure you check it, but is there any significant change in the area since you've been doing that?
It's been getting better. As a whole, the Nansman Ridge has been getting better, but because we've continuously replenished it, there's been more market oysters there on the whole Nansman Ridge, and in this area there's been more spat, small, and the markets have decreased at the same level, or increased at the same level as the adjacent part of Nansman Ridge that we haven't been removing seed from. So on a whole, this whole area has been getting better, and the area that's had that heavy replenishment specifically for seed has also been getting better as well. So that whole area, everywhere that we've been replenishing the James, has been going up together, including this area.
Mr. Kell?
Could we potentially have a longer lower James River season for market hand scrape if we were not to move this resource?
Again, that would be a discussion that we could have. It would be one more option in terms of allowing that. But again, I think the limiting factor isn't this seed plant. In terms of the James River, this is a very small area compared to the 4,000 acres of hand scrape area that are open. Don't quote me on that exact acreage, but this is a very small percentage of the area that's open to hand scrape. So I think the limiting factor isn't this seed plant, it's how long the season is and the other rocks. So you're not going to have the whole James River fleet supported by 40 acres in the lower Nansemond Ridge.
I guess where I look at that is what's the best return for the dollar for the overall. You know, the Potomac tribs, we've continually planted and planted and planted and planted. At some point, I think we need to evaluate what the payback on that is, and does it pay more to be here?
Well, I guess 10,000 of these bushels the last 2 years have gone into area 6, 7, and 8 in the Rappahannock, and people have done quite well
Thinking
up
through
there.
that too, I think they're in pretty good shape right now too. Shell would probably do just as well in those areas, but I just thinking through the whole thing.
So Andrew, this area has been worked dredging this year for market oysters?
That's correct, yeah.
Is that considered Area 1, or is it Nansemond Ridge, I guess?
Yeah, that's that lower, I guess, area 3 is what it would be on the season, but that's the Nansemond Ridge area there. And again, this whole area has worked. In this area, I mean, I haven't seen exactly where the boats are out there, but this is an area that probably has more small, more shell, and less dredge full of larger oysters, whereas areas outside these shell plants likely have more market oysters when you actually drag a dredge across them. Again, that's what I would anticipate based on where we put the shell and the survey there. But I'm not sure if there's anyone here who's been actively scraping on top of that area, but I imagine they'd probably be working off of it or closer to upriver areas. This has probably had about 6 to 12 boats, I think. The lower James River, most of the fleet has been focused in the upriver area this year.
So I kind of guess going back to my last question, if we don't take the seed from here, do we have anywhere else that we can take the seed from? Will we still be able to continue the program?
I guess there isn't anything that's proposed right now in terms of a large boats program. I mean, there is the Great Wacomico that we talked about as a seed area that we can replenish. And there is, I mean, there are some areas that have had decent recruitment, but those areas really wouldn't be conducive or as conducive to this. And again, this area that you see right here is where the fossil shell dredge digs, so it's the cheapest area that we can plant shell and replenish. So that's another advantage of removing this area.
Great Wacomico couldn't supply you with, but what, 20% of what you need?
Yeah, I mean, I think 5,000 bushels would sort of be a push in terms of what we want to take out of the Great Wacomico.
I think in experience also, I mean, we've done it, but Great Wacomico is not the best. Those 3 areas are not the best for large boat transfer. I mean, Shell Bar maybe, but the other 2 are really dicey trying to do that with a big boat.
So do you plant this you shell this every year?
We've shelled it every year that we've removed seed from it, yes.
And how much does it cost to shell it? Per bushel?
It depends again on the total size of the contract, but it costs in the $2 to $3 a bushel range.
So when you factor in that the oysters that you're removing from this rock cost $2 to $3 to put there, then it costs $6 to move it to another area, that's not a very big difference versus, like Mr. Cowart said, we're using shaft tongs. That's only a $3 difference. So you really get the same bang for your buck. Would you agree? Or you don't get as large of a difference banging for your buck. Would you agree?
Well, yeah, no, $12 is more than $9. So,
Right.
yeah, I mean, but again, when you're multiplying by thousands of bushels, 2 cents makes a difference, and a quarter makes a difference, and $3 is a pretty big difference in terms of the
Sure,
amount
but
you can actually do.
the difference is in the shaft tong area, you're removing seed from an area that was designed to be removed for a shaft tong area. Here, you're removing seed from an area that's designed to be harvested for market oysters, which I think is to Mr. Johnson's point.
Well, I mean, again, this is a program that's run specifically to help the fishery out. So if you all don't want a seed program, I mean, I'd be glad to do that. I'm not sure, I would be glad to do that. I think we'd want to look for some options, but again, the intent of this is to help the collective fishery out. So I'm open to options. One of the options that we could do is we could advertise for seed oysters from the hand tong area as an option and see what the price point is. That's what led us to this in the past, is no one was willing to do it for what collectively the commission and the committee was willing to pay. So,
Do you think there's a happy medium between dredge by oysters here and shaft tong oysters? Using some of the money for dredge by and some of the money for shaft tong oysters?
I'm open to options, yep.
Well, I can't make a motion. Do we need a recommendation, a motion, or what would you like here? But I can't do either one.
Well, I guess, go ahead.
What if, could we approve a seed program that gives staff the latitude to look at the options? And, I mean, obviously, we got a dollar amount to work in, and I don't know, we would have to decide here tonight which one it would be, and I don't think that's possible till you find out what the availability of
Well,
harvest is.
I think one of the options that we could have is we can have a set price point that we'd like to do this amount, and we can put a notice out for what that is for shaft tong areas. We can put that out for this, and we can incorporate that into the plan, and that we can do either or. And if there's, say, we only want to, or the advisory committee wants to say, we don't want to do 20,000 bushels from this area, we want to do up to a certain amount, or we can chop it up however we'd like, and one option would be to do that.
How many of the 20,000 bushels were you wanting to move to higher salinity areas that you don't feel that the hand tong oysters from the seed area would survive well at?
It's kind of right on that edge, but 5,000 would definitely be in the comfort zone for the low salinity areas, and that depending on salinity, which changes a little bit more in the Rappahannock, 10 to 15,000 would probably do better from these areas than from the other areas. And those would be if we did do the seed program in the Rappahannock and the Pocomoke Sound area.
It would not be wise to put oysters from the upper James River into high salinity places. It'd be,
Yeah, generally not, yeah, good
that
idea.
should factor into this decision pretty good.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead.
So we essentially we're looking at two things here. One, whether to pass the Great Wacomica by and investigate looking at a market seed fishery there. And then we've got the separate issue of James River seed. Am I thinking correctly there?
You can tell you've been paying attention to General Assembly there, but yeah, we'd be passing by the passing by on the Great Wacomico seat.
So maybe those would be two different issues that we need to address.
Yeah, I would be prepared to make a motion on the Great Wacomica that we pass by this year, assuming that you said Rich was in favor of that, to pass by the Great Wacomica this year
And the
study
Pianki
that
tank, right?
further. I'm sorry.
What we're talking about, the Pianki tank too, Andrew?
I think,
Passing by that?
yeah, and basically looking at that similar,
So you mean pass them up as a seed area?
Pass them up as seed this year to look at what the market / seed fishery looks like that Andrew discussed earlier.
Okay. We have a motion.
Can I add to that? Mr. Cullen, can I add to that?
That's up to
Yeah,
Mr.
I have a
You'll
s-
make an amendment, sure.
I have a suggestion that maybe we go on with the 20,000 from James River, but if we're 20,000 bushels from James River. But if we decide to pass up on the Great Wacomico River, maybe we could use the leftover funds to explore a James River shaft tong, use that money to plant James River shaft tong seed, to Mr. Cowart's point, to kind of test that fishery out. If that money's not going to be used for moving the shells out of Nansemond Ridge, instead of moving more shells out of Nansemond Ridge, we could use that in a different place to kind of test out those theories and see how they work.
Is that acceptable to you, Mr. Calhoun?
It is, but I think that would probably tie more into the James River part of the discussion, but it would, I think it would be the two different rivers, but if we pass it by, obviously that money that Andrew has there, I think what you're saying, Peyton, we would look at where that money would go as far as James River or what have you.
Sure, so basically, we would still plant the 20,000 bushels of James River and pass by the Great Wacomico, but use the Great Wacomico funds to possibly plant shaft tongue oysters, to Mr. Cowart's point, to see if there's a difference in the return.
Yeah, I think, just to clarify, I think he's just trying to say, do we want to pass by the Great Wacomico and then talk about the James River? So take that first, and then,
Oh, okay.
then that's definitely would be an option, is that correct? Yep.
Yeah. I would, so it would be Great Wacomico and Pianki Tank.
Ernie seconded.
Okay.
I have a second from Mr. George. Further discussion? Not hearing any. I'll call the question. I'll start from my right.
What's that?
We're gonna
Can
vote.
I ask a quick question? My apologies.
That's all right,
It's
go
a little
ahead.
hard to follow the exact motion. Andrew, do you mind just recapping exactly what's on the table now?
Okay, so I believe the motion is to pass by removing any seed oysters from the Great Wacomico or Piankatank rivers, so that they can be considered at a later date as potentially part of a harvest season. So basically, not remove any seed oysters from the Great Wacomico and Piankatank as part of the replenishment plan.
Okay, thanks. And it's 20,000 from James River, or are we addressing that in a different motion?
I think that's going to be a separate motion. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Sure, Jackie.
Further questions or discussion? Hearing none, I'll call the question.
I agree with that. Yes.
It's aye.
Aye.
Mr. Kellum is on the phone. Who we have, Dan?
Dan, Jackie,
Aye.
and Beverly, you still there? Might have lost Beverly there. Okay.
Chair votes aye as well, so motion passes.
All right, let me make a note. Should have brought my red pen there. But, all right. I guess, is there any other questions about the James River, those areas, the 20,000 bushels from Nansman Ridge? Already.
Any discussion or?
So the way I'm understanding it is 20,000 bushels from Nasman Ridge with the funds from Great Wacomico to be used in a upriver shaft tone project to compare. Is that kind of what I'm getting at?
That was my suggestion.
All right. But, Mr. Johnson?
So there's 150, at the $6 price, there's $150,000 in this program, right? This seed program? Could it be simply adjusted to a 50/50? I mean, it's enough money, 75,000 would be enough money to make a seed transfer, as he proposed, worthwhile trying. It's enough that somebody would attempt to do it, and then allow enough that it would be worthwhile for, as well, a boat to come down and move a significant enough amount off of Nansman Ridge.
I
Could it
think,
be, could the money be re-proportioned that way?
I guess, I think the only issue would be, depending on how that broke out price point wise, would we want that many lower salinity oysters transported to, and if we did, where? So, I mean, that would sort of be, we could try to break it up dollar wise, but depending on where prices came in, or we can set a price right now. The commission has that authority for this program, is we can say, this is the price that we will pay for both programs. So we can the commission has that authority to do that.
If you did, say you did that and say you set it at $10, just for a number, and you had no takers, at what point would you take that money and abandon the seed transfer from the Shaftong areas and put it all at the Nansman Ridge area?
We'll usually post the notices for about 2 weeks as soon as the commission approves the plan. So, I mean, we can make that decision pretty quickly in terms of shifting. So we can say.
Mid-March sometime.
Mhm.
You think that would be a fair
Andrew,
way to
was,
see if there's
that
interest? in
40
it?
acres,
I think it needs to
checked,
be a
have you
significant-
checked, how many market oysters in it?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This is right there.
Somebody's
Oh,
gonna have
there's
a boat and a truck and the rest to make it worthwhile somebody doing, to get a feel for it.
I'm sorry, but somebody didn't hear that.
I was just asking him, had he checked the 40 acres that they would remove to see how many market oysters were in there?
Yes, no, so there's an area that we haven't moved. There's a lot less oysters in general, but the number of markets is pretty high. I mean, close to 10 markets per square meter in this area. Again, the scale's a little off on this one. But again, there's 5 to 10 markets per square meter in the area that has been planted with shell. There's just a lot more small and spat in
It's
that
a
area.
lot less then.
Yeah.
in
So
that
there's a lot more mixed in with it.
Yeah.
That isn't just markets, where there's a lot more just markets on the area that wasn't planted.
Yes, Mr. Johnson's point, could you go back to your point, Mr. Johnson, about the notification, would it be enough? And when, if we didn't get enough interested seed tongers, going back to Nansman Ridge to get the rest that we need, you think a notification by mid-March gives oyster tongers enough time?
I mean, it would be the tongers as well as a transporter. That would be the big limiting factor in that too, would be somebody to.
Yeah, I know we don't have
I
any.
mean, the state's gonna have to buy the seed and the state's gonna have to pay somebody to transport it and plant it.
Right.
So, I mean, whatever that overboard price is gonna go to 2 places.
I would really like to have some kind of estimate on how much it costs, because I know things are quite a bit costlier this year than they have been in the past.
I'd like to make a question and a suggestion. So we have $150,000 to spend on this project?
That's kind of roughly
Okay.
what we're in there.
And we're expecting Nansman Ridge oysters to cost $6 a bushel at 20,000 bushels,
Mhm.
which leaves us with a balance of $30,000.
Well, again, we try to put it out, that's sort of a range depending on the
Sure.
area, so in that
Rough
$6 to
numbers.
$7 range. So
Yeah,
we have-
rough numbers.
Right.
I would suggest that to use that $30,000 to plant a trial of James River seed Shaftong oysters. Jamie, what would it cost to plant that from the mob jack? Like if you were to take 30,000 bushels, how many bushels could you plant of Shaftong oysters, assuming you pay $6 a bushel, which is the going rate for James River Shaftong oysters? Depends on where it's going. Where would you plant this?
Probably these would be most appropriate to go into, I guess it would be the Comico, I think, would be scheduled for planting this year. That was just open, so. And we could do some areas in Tacoma, but Tacoma, basically upper Potomac areas there.
You look at it like
$4 to $5. So my suggestion would be to take that 30,000 and try to plant the leftover money from the object, try to plant some Shaftong seed just to see what it looks like, since that money is left over anyway. And I think it would be tough to mobilize tractor trailers and falls just for one trip, because what is that? That's 2,500 bushels. That's one trip in the mob jack, right? So that would be an option.
You speaking of the mob jack or the Waikawa?
I'm sorry, the mob jack, the buy boat.
Oh, okay, mob jack, okay,
Yeah.
right. Because it ain't nothing left in the mob jack.
Further discussion?
All right.
That $150,000, that doesn't go in putting the shelves back that have been removed, does it?
That's correct. That would be a separate part of the shell planting. And again, that area is open prior to seed being removed for the entire harvest season as well, so. And
Mr. Connell, go ahead.
What if we looked at doing 10 and 10, and that way you could start the process when I say 10 and 10, 10 of dredge relocate and 10 of hand tong and transport, and that way you can at least start the process and, you know, people know what they're doing, and I'm sure the guys with the dredge boats and the buy boats, they'd like to have an idea of what they're doing before March, so
Right.
it would at least give Andrew some latitude to get started.
Right.
A suggestion.
It's a good suggestion, and I also want us to think about, you know, if we can't get that shaft tong quota met, where it can be,
Come back
to the Nasman Ridge area and finish it. That's just my suggestion, so. If not any further discussion, to accept the motion, unless you have something else, Andrew?
I guess the only one would be if all things, let's say we got it for the equal price, I mean, that potentially, if we're looking for 10,000 bushels of shaft tong seed, that would be a lot of those lower salinity oysters, and the question would be, do we want to put that much into, really the Potomac Tribs are the best areas that we'd plant with that.
How many are scheduled to go in the Potomac Tribs?
What we've been doing is about 5,000 bushels is about right for if we're doing, you know, a single tributary.
Okay.
Well, in the upper Rappahannock, in what area, 7, Tommy? Area 8?
Probably area 8 or 9, and 8 anyway.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, there are those hand tong areas all the way up to upper Rappahannock that they probably would do okay in up that far that we haven't done anything in a while, so that would be an option.
It was implied in the commission meeting that the sanctuary in the James River was in disrepair a little bit or going downhill. Would that not be a good spot for some of those oysters? Your hands tied on that?
No, there is some other stuff in the replenishment plan that we might be able to address that with. Yeah.
All things considered, and it is a lot to consider.
Well, we could I can maybe see if I can try to kind of collect everything here. So one option that I could probably wrap my head around anyway is look at making an attempt to move 5,000 bushels of hand tong, James River seed to the Potomac Tribs. Again, look at the areas where we could potentially move an additional 5,000 depending on that price point. And then look at moving 10,000 bushels of the Nasman River seed areas. And again, that 5,000 bushels, maybe that's where the flex is. So sort of say up to 10,000 bushels of James River seed and up to 15,000 bushels of Nasman River seed. And that would give us the flexibility to try to get the most moved for the least dollar price to the best areas. If
Can
that
you
works.
fashion,
Take it forward.
I was just asking, could you fashion that in a presentation to the commission that it doesn't have to go again? That,
I think so.
you know, I guess what I'm looking at is just the time factor. I've been on the side that the buy boat guys are gonna be and trying to figure out what they're doing and where it's, so it just would hate to see it drug out. If I'm in favor as long as it gives you the flexibility to react quickly.
Yeah, I think we can work that into the plan. I can write that up tomorrow, more or less what I said right there, that up to 10,000 bushels and up to, you know, we could leave it at 20,000 bushels and depending on that price point, or 15 if the group here is more comfortable with that. So.
I'll make that motion at 15. I don't think I can restate everything you just said.
So up to 15,000 bushels from Nasman Ridge and up to 10,000 bushels from those seed areas.
With the ability to adjust.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir.
I think that sounds good.
I'll second that.
Mr. Johnson, motion, Mr. Coleman, second. Further discussion? Anybody on the phones have any discussion?
I think, Dan, were you trying to say something there earlier?
I think it was Mr. Coward asked, or somebody asked the same question that I was getting ready to ask. I can't remember who it was, so I was satisfied.
Okay.
No further discussion, I'll call the question. Aye.
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 Dan is aye, and we have the two ladies on there.
I think I heard an aye from Dan. And Jackie, do you have a vote on that?
Aye.
And chair votes aye as well. Passes unanimously. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, let me make sure I got a note there on the plan. Okay, we're getting on there a little bit. I can go through this next part relatively quickly. It's the shell planting portion. It's similar to what we've done for decades now in terms of putting the most amount of shell overboard for the least amount of price, a combination of house shell, shell caught from dredged areas, and that reef shell that's hydraulically mined. So we try to get the most shell overboard in the areas that are most in need for the lowest price per bushel. So that's the intent of this, and I'll go through these quick. All right. So shell planting. So again, there's some pictures. Right now in the budget, the majority of those general funds for replenishment are going to be spent on as much as we can get in that $250 range on those lower James River areas, close to Nansman Ridge, up to $4.50 a bushel is ballpark what we've been paying for either planting house shell or fossil shell, or there's an area on the seaside of the Eastern Shore where we've been catching sort of dredge shell, so there's some naturally occurring shell deposits. So 600 to 800 acres on harvest areas. We may do, if we can roll into some of the restoration funding, maybe up to $70,000 in non-general funds for add to that. So those might be some user fee funds, or we've had some other cost recovery from some of these grants. So that's one of the other advantages of when we get these large grants that come into VMRC, we can recoup some of that cost and indirect costs that comes to the agency, and then we can use the grant funding that was for restoration work, and we can use that indirect cost because we're pretty good at doing these things cheaply to put back into replenishment projects. So that's one of the advantages of those big $1 million dollar amounts that you see, is we can use some of that to actually run the program and help. So anyway, there's some of that funding available to go towards shell planting this year in the bay and tributaries. And again, on the Eastern Shore, 6.5 to 13 acres, depending on the condition. We plant about 5,000 to 10,000 bushels in the intertidal areas there. The Nature Conservancy has generously been able to have some grant funding that's come to the commission for a number of years. And again, some of that general funds for restoration would be used for these areas. And this is actually, the Nature Conservancy has been planting harvest areas recently out there the last 2 or 3 years, and we've been using some of our restoration-specific funding for sanctuary. So there's been a little bit of a role reversal, but again, these are low-impact harvest areas that are on the seaside, and there's not a whole lot of harvest activity out there, but I can tell you there are a whole lot of oysters right now. But most of these areas are shallow intertidal, and there's a whole lot of oysters in a lot of other places where you don't have to get out of your boat. But anyway, we'd like to keep this program going for both of those there. Again, you saw this earlier. These are the areas that are, why we do this is so we maintain a certain level of shell volume per meter so that we can take advantage of that spat set. Again, right now we're actually in better shape in terms of shell volume than we have been in a long time. So if you take out all of the upper James River seed areas, that there's many thousands of acres there that are pretty patchy, where these shell volumes are lower and where we can't actually get these large replenishment barges. So if you take those acres out, there are 366 acres in primarily the areas that we traditionally replenish that are in need. Sometimes in past years this number has been over 1,000. So that's pretty good. And again, that's just less than 5 liters. So there's still, when you look at that 10-liter volume, normally this number is much, much higher, again, in the multiple thousands. There's 1,500 acres that are between 5 and 10,000 acres. And in terms of the priority, likely in the budget for this year, about 653 acres is what we're going to target, and this is a combination of these areas that are in need of shell and areas that were in the harvest rotation in the Rappahannock and portions of the James River that likely had some of the higher effort. So right now in our survey, we haven't gone back and checked these areas, but based on observations of boats and past surveys, these areas are likely in need. So that sort of is what gets us at that priority for shell of 653 acres. And again, many of those acres are in the open harvest areas that had effort this year that we're going to target. So there's just a quick overview of the public ground in blue and the areas that were open to harvest this year. And most of that replenishment, again, is going into the, actually, the majority of it is going into the areas that were open to either hand scraping or dredging this year. Areas that have been open to patent tonging or hand tonging are likely not in need of any replenishment activity. So we can focus more of that replenishment activity on improving these dredge and hand scrape areas. So our dollars go a little bit further. The areas in the Pocomoke, Tangier Sound, again, some of these areas are in pretty good shape. Some less so, but we'd probably like to put some shell on Johnson's. I think it's had a pretty good amount of effort. Onancock there. Marshalls and Bird were open in this rotation season. We're not going to plant Parkers, Dan, this year. And then also there's an area that we're working on feeling out there. I think Dan still owes me some numbers, but we're going to try to get over there before this is underway and really feel it out. That's been holding up one of those older areas similar to some of the spots in the Rappahannock called Island Rock there. And we're going to try to get some of the shells that would have gone to Parker's on Island Rock there this year. So we're going to try to feel that out. Probably do about 20 or 30 acres in that location. Do you follow that, Dan?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Great Wacomico, again, focus on the areas that were opened this year and look at Blackberry again. This is an area that's got a lot of bottom. So depending on how we come out budget-wise, we may look at expanding that shell plant in Blackberry Hangs area a little bit, but this is an area that's being worked right now and is kind of a standalone area, so it'll likely be in need. And again, these areas held up pretty well this year, I think, but they're likely in need of at least some shelling. So about 42 acres, give or take, in the Great Wacomico. Rappahannock, again, focus on the areas 3 and 5 that were open to harvest this year. Again, we're leaving them in pretty good shape, which is a good thing, so we're not going to have to go too heavy. Usually for these areas, again, we shoot for about 1,000 bushels per acre, but if these areas are still pretty good right on top of the reefs, we might drop that down to 800 or 900 bushels, sort of a little bit of a lighter coating. But again, these are areas that are continuously planted with shell and then are left for 2 or 3 years and open to harvest. So this has been going on for 2 decades now, and it's helped maintain these areas. So again, Temples Bay area and Parrot Rock area, 3 and 5, as well as some of the areas in the upriver area. There are some areas kind of in the Smoky Point area that are in need of a little bit of shell, and this area right here that I'm circling here, the one more time with the name?
Manaskin Bluff.
Manaskin Bluff there is the name of this rock, and we actually got out last week and got some pretty good numbers on it and identified it. And I mean, it's a pretty large area, but probably in the 20 to 40 bushel range we could plant there. It was an old shell plant from probably back in the 70s or 80s. At some point they'd done some work there. But again, it's an area that had a lot of boats, 20 or so boats working on it this year. And again, get a little bit of shell back there and see if, now that we're in this sort of surplus area where we don't have quite the shell budget deficit that we've had in the past, try to give this area a little bit of a boost.
Would you anticipate 3 and 5 being house shells?
I think, again, probably as depending on how much is needed there, a good portion that would likely be house shells. This is another question that might take some discussion from SMAC. Is Mobjack is open to harvest right now. I mean, it has had 6 to 12 boats that have been continuously working there, as my understanding. I'm not sure this week how they've been doing. But this was an area that does periodically get very high spat sets. We'd seen them in the past. This was an area that we decided to move seed from because, again, we plant shell there. We had 2 years where we got a really good spat set, and before it was open to harvest, there wouldn't be shell, and there wouldn't be spat, and there wouldn't be small oysters there. So we moved 20,000 bushels, or roughly, 11,000 bushels, give or take, from pulses and a little bit from toe steak the year before last, or last year, and this area was open to harvest this year. So this area, based on our survey, is one of the areas most in need. Again, it's the question of, do we want to try to shell this area again? Now that it's sort of on the radar that there was an issue here, I think they're getting good numbers. There's likely a potential that we wouldn't have those issues with the small oysters not being there the next year, but again, that was a concern, and that was why the commission and advisory committee decided to move the oysters in the first place. So this is a very productive area. It's still very good bottom. We've had issues in the past. I hope those issues don't happen again, but this is a question for the committee of whether or not we want to put our limited shell resource in these areas here. Again, this is an area that would typically be in the rotation. It would take pressure off other areas. If we don't put shell back there, it's likely that it won't be available. So it's kind of one of those things that we have to decide what to do in this area. And we do have.
First year they got anything off it, didn't it?
What's that?
To mount that thing. This is the first year we got anything off it to mount that thing.
Right. And that was after we moved 11,000 bushels off of it. So.
If you plant shell here, do you expect to move it again with a dredge by?
Again, if we get a phenomenal spat set here, that's an option. So it has been recently a pretty high recruitment area, and it's a good area to do that. So if we do plant it this year and we do get a spat set, that's something we could consider on moving that shell again. It would maybe be another seed area, or we could leave it or move them out of it, or keep it sort of as we had, move some shell and still keep it in the rotation. But if we don't put shell back, it's likely if we keep it open in these areas, they're just going to get worse and worse likely.
Well, yeah, but I think you're overstating the potential of not having it there and put more pressure on other places, Andrew. I mean, there's nothing come off of there in years, and the years that I've sat on this committee, there's been nothing come off of there, and now, I understand there's something coming off of there this year, but you just said it's 6 to 12 boats. Are we going to sit here and throw money on a rock for 6 to 12 boats, or are we going to put this money somewhere else that it can be used for that's more purposeful? I mean, we went through all this last year. I mean, this is the first time that anything's come off of it, and now we want to throw a fortune on it again. We've thrown 100 fortunes on it. I'd like to be able to swim in the money we're throwing on that. And I just think to put it honest, I think it's nuts to put money back there again.
I think we should put it somewhere where it's more productive.
What about the other areas in Mobjack? Are they productive? Are they in a closed rotation right now?
There's really no other areas other than Browns Bay that we planted, and that's a sanctuary area. We haven't. There is some funding available for more restoration work that's targeted to Mobjack, that's sanctuary specific. But again,
Toe steak and pulses, they're both.
These are the harvest areas, yeah.
And they're both open right now?
That's correct.
Ernie's point, I think it would make more sense to go to, somewhere we're gonna, see a bigger benefit from.
Mm-hmm.
And I completely agree with Dan. I mean, we go through this, quite often, and we don't see it here, but we've seen the graphs that you've shown in years past where we have a huge population, and we go back and it's 40% of what it what it was.
I think, I mean, that's really, I think on a staff level, I think we'd be supportive of that if that's a recommendation, is to hold off on this until,
You need a motion?
what's that?
You need a
I was gonna
motion?
ask Dan, so, that's what I was gonna ask Dan. Dan, you stated that so eloquently, would you like to make a motion?
So do I need to make a motion?
You can, certainly.
I make a motion to not put any shells on the object. Put them, I don't know where to put them. Put them somewhere more useful. I don't, you know, if you want to put it in the same rotation into York River so it stays in the same, you know, the same locality, I'm fine with that. Somewhere that it is more useful, just, I make a motion not to put any more shells in my object.
I'll second it.
We have a motion from Dan and a second from Mr. George. Any further comments or discussion? If not, I'll call the question.
Aye.
Aye. On the phone, Dan
Aye.
and
Aye.
anybody else?
I think that was it, yep.
That's it? Chair votes aye as well. Unanimous. Thank you.
So that's the mob jack, and again, the James River, the areas are in pretty good shape, based on our last survey in the upper James River. So we planted them for a number of years with reef shell. The areas that are most in need, and again, relatively easy to plant with the larger barges this year, our lower brown shoal here. So this has had a fair number of boats the last 2 years and hasn't had any recent shell. Some of the upper Thomas's areas have had more recent shell planting, but lower brown shoal here is one of the areas that's more in need. And again, the Nansman Ridge area would sort of take the most of it. Most of the other areas in the James, at least at this point, are above that brown leader threshold. So they're not in heavy need of shell, and the fleet has been relatively spread out there. So another option in terms of this shell is to look at getting some more shell on the better parts of Nansman Ridge that are open to harvest, to help with the concerns that were brought up by the advisory committee about moving those seeds. So we can add shell to the Nansman Ridge beyond those areas that were intentionally planted for the seed program there, and that would be an option to maybe address some of the concerns that were brought up by the committee. But again, those are the two large areas in the James River that are most in need of shell based on our survey there.
What did your survey say on how many liters
Um,
on Lansman Ridge?
It depends by area, but it was under that 10-liter threshold, so almost everywhere. Most of the areas right now, based on our survey, are above that 5-liter threshold, but the Nansman and the lower brown shoal were below that 10 liters.
But you feel comfortable that the spot that you planted is above 10?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Make more sense to move 15,000 bushels off something that's below 10.
No. That's on the whole Nansman Ridge. The area that was planted is in pretty good shape. Yeah, I think it's closer to 12 or more liters. And that really is the majority of that $2.5 million. It goes pretty quick, but that would be the focus shell planting areas. Again, about that 600 to 700 acre range is what we shoot for.
Discussion, if not a motion? More questions?
Don't all speak at once.
What do we,
Well, I guess this would
we're making
be,
a motion to approve this part of the plan.
and really it's for spending $2.5 million on shell planting on the harvest areas, and up to 0 to 500,000 of restoration funding on sanctuary areas. So again, depending on price point and what type of shell, we might use some of that restoration funding to try to get the price down without using too much of the shell resource. So
Make it 4 million, I'll vote for it. No, I'm just kidding. Well,
You had mentioned earlier about that you were going to bring up the sanctuary to James River later.
Yep, yep.
I guess I missed it.
Not in this portion here.
Other business here.
I thought that was under the replenishment.
No, that'll be, yeah, there's some other funding that we're looking at that's sort of separate from this general funding to look at that. Yeah.
I make a motion that we spend the money to complete the Andrew A. line.
We have a motion from Mr. Cow
I'll second it.
and a second. Any more discussion? If not, I'll call the question.
Aye.
I'm sorry to ask this again, I'm having a hard time hearing. Can you repeat the motion?
You would go ahead?
Yeah, the motion would be that we would accept the repletion outline that Andrew gave us a while ago for spending money to put shells back on the bottom.
Minus the
Okay,
mob
great.
jack. Right.
Right, thank you, appreciate that.
You on, you next?
Aye.
Aye.
Abstention, and I need to publicly disclose, Kellum Brothers may be a potential contractor for this work.
Thank you. Dan?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Chair votes aye as well. That's unanimous. Thank you, Mr. Butler.
All right. Now, we'll move on. This is the alternative culture stone portion of the plan, and most of this is getting paid for with that restoration-specific funding. But we have permitted sites in harvest areas. I mean, we've done a number of them in the Rappahannock, Butler's Hole, and Bush Rock there that have been done with smaller stone, and we have some other areas permitted already in part of the lower James River and Tangier and Pocomoke Sound, and some other areas off of Deep Rock, and some other areas in the Rappahannock. So we have some areas that are permitted, and we can always seek more permit authorization if something were to happen to, say, the shell dredge, or for some reason we weren't able to complete our shell planning portion of this plan. We want to have some areas that we could at least do with that alternative substrate. So we've planted smaller size rock in dredge and scrape areas. It will likely be fine in some patent tong areas. Again, you can't usually plant rock in some of these softer hand tong areas or sort of that softer, muddier clay. You generally need something that's a little harder, more on the sandy side of mud rather than the muddy side of sand. But anyway, so we have those areas permitted for replenishment, but most of these areas would be part of the restoration. Some of it towards the Bay Agreement goals. That's the majority of that capital funding is going towards the 2014 Bay Agreement goals. And most of that is going to be focused in the York River, but I'll outline that now. Again, this is the funding sources, so up to 200 acres. Most of that, again, in the York River at 250 to 1,000 tons per acre. Again, 1,000 tons, I don't know if it's again, but 1,000 tons is about volumetrically 6 inches of stone. If you put it right overboard in a clean sheet, and 250 is, sort of in that 1 to 2-ish inches range. So that's height off the bottom on average. Again, the funding is a little bit uncertain on this, but the majority of that capital fund is going into this, that $5 million roughly that's there, as well as some of the other restoration sources and NOAA federal grants. And we're going to try to pursue another couple opportunities for alternative substrate as well. And again, we might have an option if we need to do some in the replenishment, but 0 to 50 acres is probably what we propose. We could increase that if we needed to, but sort of look at that if we need to, if we can't find the shells that we need to complete the program. That's probably about what we have permitted now in terms of harvest areas in that 0 to 50 acre range that would be suitable for this. We could look at expanding that if needed. And again, the majority of this, I think we went over this last year, would be in these areas that are the lower York River. So our harvest areas are all upriver, and a lot of that stonework would be focused in these areas here, as well as these areas across over by Wormley Creek. Not all of these areas would be constructed on, but we have close to 250 acres permitted for 6 to 12 inches of stone already in these areas, and this would be towards meeting the Virginia's Bay Agreement goals for large-scale oyster restoration. And again, this lets us get good at planting rock, because one day, maybe 20, 30 years from now, there's not going to be a shell deposit that we can work with cheaply, and this will be a good alternative that we'll be pretty good at with this. And again, whenever possible, trying to have multiple contractors mobilized, doing multiple work, and bringing down some of that cost and recovering some of it to run other parts of the program. The other areas that we're likely to get some federal funding for are specific to the mobjack. So there's some areas here that are already sanctuary areas, and we'll likely look at permit authorization, have to permit some new areas outside of the existing harvest areas for that alternative substrate work. Some might be in shallow intertidal areas, but again, this is sort of separate from the harvest stuff that we're doing, but I wanted to make sure that this group was aware of that there. And again, we are looking at pursuing an opportunity for some grant funding to do some alternative substrate planting in the rec shoals area. Likely we could use a combination of smaller substrate in firmer areas and maybe some larger substrate that could be more harvest resistant. We're looking at, again, the funding wouldn't necessarily be in place, but trying to get that funding in place this year and likely do some construction in the next calendar year in this area. But looking at having doing a little bit of mitigation for what we saw in the survey, and hopefully having a little bit more permanence to that. And that would be included as part of this plan, pending funding becoming available.
Andrew, may I ask a question about rec shoals? What are your estimates? I think I understood that their estimate was that there was a loss of large oysters and clutch material off of rec shoals.
That's correct, yeah.
At what numbers?
Based on our survey there, that was roughly 40,000 bushels of markets weren't there based on the survey, and roughly 135,000 bushels of shell total. So that includes the markets, the smalls, and the spat over the 584.84 acre area that is surveyed in rec shoals.
Over what period of time? Over a year, 2 years, 3 years, or what?
We'd estimate we likely saw it start showing up in our last year's survey, so probably in the 2-year to 18-month range.
And Andrew, what was the number on estimated substrate removal?
Based on sort of that extrapolation of multiplying liters by square meters, about 135,000 bushels.
Thank you.
So, do you sample it twice a year, and at what point of the year did most of them disappear?
Well, we sometimes sample in the spring. We noticed it between the spring, and we don't sample every year, twice a year, but we noticed it between last fall, and then it showed up blatantly on this year's survey. So in that 12-month period is where the largest drop likely took place. But we did see the numbers start to come down, going all the way back to 2020, or 2019, I guess, was what the first. 2020 we first saw them start to come down, and then 2021, this recent fall, is where we saw that largest drop.
So what is, if your numbers are accurate, what is law enforcement done to try to enforce the law in that area?
I don't want to, I think law enforcement isn't here right now, but they've been made aware of it. I'm not sure the specific tasks that have been instigated by them, but we're working with them to try to address these issues. But I don't have anything specific that I can offer at this point.
So when Andrew came to me with these numbers, once we had a shellfish division, which wasn't until November, December timeframe, we pretty quickly went to law enforcement and went over the numbers with the concerns. And I don't have specific details either at the moment of what law enforcement is specifically doing related to this issue. But they were very attentive to the numbers. They were very concerned. We do have some task force type people working on general issues like this statewide. And they definitely said, this would be put on that priority list. We will continue to work with them on this problem. And, I can't give you more specifics than that right at the moment. Matt was here earlier, but he's left. They had a law enforcement. And just while I got the floor, our acting commissioner is here today, Justin Worrell, if you don't know who he is. And it's kudos to him for sitting through this meeting, which most commissioners wouldn't do. But anyway, and I can assure you he's aware of the problem too, and we've all been working with law enforcement on this. So, it is a concern, and we hope to fix it. And I think this alternative substrate here, if we use some of the larger material, which would be more resistant to someone harvesting in the area, might be helpful for this site, since it is a sanctuary. So.
Can I ask a question? How many bushels of oysters are you saying that were missing off of rack shoals between that time period, approximately?
Again, the number of shell volume is estimated at 135,000 bushels.
So there's 135,000 bushels missing off of rack shoals and no one got caught taking them?
Again, I don't know if there's been any specific tickets for that, but I don't believe.
Not that I'm aware of.
That's just a lot of oysters.
I understand. We understand that.
I mean, that'd take a lot of effort, just that many oysters. That wouldn't be one person, I'm saying.
Be over 300 tractor trailer loads of oysters.
That would be a large effort.
Well, I guess I could go over the numbers. It could be, if it's going over 18 months, it could be 4 or 5 boats, 2 or 3 nights a week. Would be all that it would take. So it depends. 18 months is a long time.
Insulting to law enforcement, they didn't catch that.
Just think we should explore, maybe try to figure out if there's another way, what's happening, not, if it's not thievery, then, we kind of need to figure out the problem, or is there anything we can do about it,
I think it was checked with sonar when you could see dredge tracks. Is that correct?
Yes. There's some evidence from sonar that something was going on out there. And again, we're looking at the total. We're working with Bims on this too. I thought it was an awful large number too, and I couldn't wrap my head around it for quite some time. But we've done the numbers, and Andrew's numbers are correct. It wouldn't have taken too many boats working illegally out there. And the thing to keep in mind, at least from my perspective, and I look at this more as a layperson than y'all do, because this is not my expertise, the public harvest type stuff. But if these were being taken, by dredge at an off-hour time, they were dredging everything. It wasn't like they were targeting market. I mean, everything's missing. There's brown shells missing, market size, seed. So y'all all know what a workboat can do if you're just dredging up, putting it on a boat, and hauling everything away. And where they went, if they were taken, and there could be some other reasons for some of these numbers. And we're not saying there couldn't be some other reason. The problem is, everywhere else in the James River seemed to be doing better. That is either being worked or not worked. And this is kind of an anomaly in the numbers in the last 18 months. So trust me, we take it seriously. And it is a sanctuary, so there should be no activity on it at all of any kind that would show this kind of sudden loss of product. So I just want to make that clear. And so, a few boats working, taking, 50 to 200 bushel per trip can add up pretty quickly. So again, I understand it's a big number and it's troubling. But it was over a fairly long period of time where we started to see this. If you look at his graph he has, we've been seeing a steady upturn on wreck shoals until 18 months ago. And it took a big dive of everything. Shell, spat, babies, seed, market size. So
Somebody breathe.
Ben, one more comment on that. Wreck shoals has been reduced in size over the years by the commission for, what is it, 2,700 acres at one time? And it was down to what, 600 or 700 now?
Yeah, it's really less than 600.
Well, the sanctuary area there itself is about 700, and the area that we survey within that is 584.84. I've done that math a lot, so.
According to your surveys, those grounds around that sanctuary have more oysters on them. So they were selling past good oysters to go in the sanctuary.
Well, no, there are some areas in the sanctuary that have larger, it's never been open to harvest, or hasn't been open to harvest recently, hasn't been open to hand tong, so there's large market oysters there. A lot of the market oysters in the seed areas aren't as marketable, if you want to say that. I mean, they're 3-inch oysters, but they're not 6, 7, 8-year-old oysters that are a large, potentially marketable size.
Andrew,
Mhm.
just, we could beat this up all night, but I would make a suggestion to the commission, Mr. Commissioner, Ben and Andrew, that a task force, including a committee, including a few industry folks, was convened to, not something that has to happen immediately, but to talk about this, and I think some industry input could probably help. Certainly, possibilities of where it could have gone or whatever. I think it would bring more credibility to the process to have someone from industry there to help you guys with the optics of it. So just a suggestion, not a motion, but just a suggestion.
I think I'm seeing lots of nodding heads, and I think we all collectively know the importance of this area. Both our law enforcement knows that, this committee knows that, and Shellfish Management Division knows that. I think that's it definitely warrants figuring out one way or another what's going on here and then addressing that. And I think that's a good way forward there on this. And again, this part of this plan would be to look for funding to maybe provide some input on that. And again, that funding it might be flexible in terms of what we can do. So I wanted to include that in this plan, to have a plan to make a plan, basically. But I think that's a good thing to do.
Absolutely.
That's what I have for alternative substrate. We got a little bit sidetracked there on the rec shoals issue, but again, just to recap, the Mobjack, the York River, those areas that may be part of the replenishment plan in the Rappahannock or other areas, if we need them, and then look at getting a permit in place for some alternative substrate in the rec shoals area in James River would be what we'd be looking to include in this year's plan for alternative substrate.
Do you need action on that?
If there's an approval on that would be good.
Somebody want to make a motion on approving this shell replenishment plan? Or substrate, alternative substrate, I'm sorry.
I'll make the motion.
We have a motion from Mr. Johnson.
I'll second it.
We have a second. Any more discussion? Hearing none, I'll call the question.
Aye.
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 Abstain for the aforementioned reason.
Right. Dan?
Aye.
All
I think
right,
Jackie got in there too. Okay.
Got 2 ayes there. All right, and the chair votes aye as well. Passes unanimously. Thank you. Thank you.
I know we're getting on there.
Yeah.
And everyone good? Do we need a break or anything? Or?
I don't think we need a break.
Okay.
What are we moving on to, other business now?
Just one last question for this committee to consider. It might take a little bit of discussion before we get on to other businesses. Currently, there's the commissioner has the authority to prohibit out-of-state seed transport. Right now, that's in place, and I think I wasn't anticipating the acting commissioner being here, but the advisory committee could make a recommendation on their thoughts of in-state allowing that prohibition to be lifted. Again, it would be ultimately the commissioner's decision, but just as a reminder, at when we established the season this year, we did decrease the total quota available in the James River. We dropped it to 90,000 bushels for these seed areas, and added this clause that if 30,000 of those bushels aren't caught in the fall season, that they're no longer part of the total quota. So without any regulatory changes, the maximum number of oysters that can be removed from the James River seed areas are 60,000 bushels. I think there's been about 2,800 or so caught this spring season since January 1st. So,
What was caught last fall? Was it 30,000 caught?
no, that wasn't caught last fall. That was, what, 18?
3,300.
Oh, yeah, only 3,300. So there's been very little seed caught.
I'm sorry. 8,000 2021 fall.
Okay, 8,000 bushels there. So, and again, that's a separate quota now. So that 30,000 bushels, if it wasn't caught, is no longer included in the spring quota this year.
Do you know how many boats that was?
There was only a handful of boats, I think, going seeding there.
So I know in the past few years, you know, you've been waiting for some bars to kind of, seed bars to kind of replenish themselves and build back up a little bit. Are the bars starting to get healthy again and seed looking good?
I think at this point, most of the bars in those areas are to the point where they've recovered to where they were before we shut them down. So if you include wreck shoals, these areas are in pretty good shape. The seed areas without wreck shoals are in even better shape. Again, most of those areas in most places are pretty good. I think Days Point is still a little bit of a concern in terms of intensive seed effort going there. This is usually where more of the Days Point and Plunta Shoals, I guess, can be areas of concern if they're focused, but as a whole, the seed areas have recovered. And again, if that is opened up out of state, that is something that if we have a good estimate of where these boats are working and how much seed is coming out. So if it looks like 40,000 bushels has come out in, I don't know, realistically a month, we can shut that to out of state, and then that 20,000 bushel quota can remain in state, and we can make that decision.
What does Horsehead look like?
Horsehead, that did have some issues, has largely recovered. So that was an area where in 2016, almost 100,000 bushels of shell and volume was not showing up on that area. Middle Horsehead, one of those rocks in those areas in that 6-7 time period have come back to where they were beforehand.
So I'm sorry, go ahead, Tom.
Would it be possible to make sure the Potomac River Fisheries Commission was covered in their seed need before we, I mean, I assume the commissioner sits on, or someone from the commission sits on PRFC now, and I think it would be prudent to cover their needs before we.
Yeah, no, I think that seed fishery can be opened and closed based on the resource, and if the commissioner determines that the level of harvest, I mean, it could be 1 day permit basically, or it could be open and closed like that. So there's pretty good discretion on that.
Bmrc considered to be out of state, or is that because Virginia is part of that compact?
Mm-hmm.
Would that be considered to be out of state?
It legally is out of state, but because we're part of the compact, I think there's I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to say legally whether it's officially in state or out, but I think for these purposes, and in the past, the commissioner has allowed PRFC to use some of this seed. Yeah. It has more of an advantage, and it's, again, a smaller amount, so Virginia Waterman can work on that. And again, it's not the same level of effort that if it was completely opened up would likely come in from out of state.
Wayne, do you know if PRFC is in a position?
Well, we have the meeting here in a couple of weeks to approve what the Shellfish Advisory Committee has recommended to try to get $60,000 worth of seed from Virginia.
It'd be nice if they could communicate to Andrew so that we could include that in these. I just wouldn't want to see us eat the allocation and PRFC be left out.
Thanks for thinking about it.
And there's no need for a recommendation. I just wanted to put that out if anyone felt strongly one way or another for discussion there. I think the resource is in better shape, but again, it can quickly go the other way if there is that focused effort. But we're in a better position regulatory-wise to prevent that from happening.
But we do have the resource for your recommendations of what can be taken from the James River.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And you do have a measure to stop out of state seed if we reach a certain point.
That's correct, yeah.
It's currently stopped now, correct?
That's
We'd have
correct.
to vote to open it back up, or the commission would?
The commissioner can make that decision, yeah.
Okay, the commission.
Short of filling what the Potomac River fisheries may need, I think, in my opinion, but if we're going to try the shaft tongue seed, for lack of a better word, study experiment that we made the motion on an hour or so ago, if out-of-state harvest could stay out of it, it would certainly keep that price point for the state of Virginia much lower by keeping the demand away.
Well, I think,
I know the economics don't always figure in as much as the standing stock and the rest, but if it's something we're gonna try to maybe move down the road with or grow or expand, then we need to look at all those factors as well.
That's a good point, because I remember, us having this discussion when we could sell out of state, and it seemed like Maryland had unlimited money, and they could pay whatever they wanted for a bushel of oysters.
well, I think maybe I can offer some thoughts on that. Is we likely want to confirm that there aren't any issues in these seed areas with a resurvey in the spring, and that would allow time to make sure the resource was in good condition. And in that time, while we're checking on the resource, which is really the determination that we have on in-state and out-of-state, economics is a factor, but it's not the only factor. It's really the condition of the resource that dictates that. But until we check on the condition of the resource, it may be advisable that out-of-state prohibition in large amounts be prohibited, and that would allow time for the limited amount as part of our replenishment program and potentially PRFC seed to move, and then we can make a determination, which we have to do based on the resource, not on economics. But again, I think it would be prudent of us to make sure that resource is in good shape before we allow that out-of-state seed harvest.
Could we possibly maybe do a virtual SMAC meeting in consultation with the commissioner and make a decision on that later? It wouldn't preclude us from starting with seed, but we could revisit that as we see how the program's going.
Yep. I think that would be, we can pass this by again and make a determination on that, leave things as they are.
Not close the door, but not.
Right.
Leave it closed out of state for right now?
Yeah, and then once we see what PRFC wants and how Andrew makes out with his program, then we can, if we've got additional quota and it's there, just we'll give the waterman access to it and give the work and go from there.
Andrew, just curious, how do you feel about possibly putting a quota on the amount of seed that can go out of state? So if we have 90,000 available, let's just say hypothetically, only 30,000 bushels could go out of state, so we would have our domestic needs met.
Well, I think the issue is there's interstate commerce rules, so we can't make it based purely on economics, but I think we can make the argument, and it would take regulatory change, that we might be able to do a quota, but it's a harder case to make, to have separate quotas for the same resource, because we can't legally make the argument based on economics. It has to be based on the condition of the resource to open and close it out of state. So it's a good idea, but it might complicate the legality of it.
I think we should revisit it in April when the hand tong season closes, and then you got May that they could work and catch as much as they want. To be a lot more boats available to work that resource if it was still available at that point.
Okay, we can put that tentatively in April, at least a virtual meeting or a discussion. And again, it's ultimately the commissioner's decision, but it'd be good to hear from the advisory group at that point. And just real quick, I didn't put that up there. That's the public harvest in bushels in calendar year. So you can see what happened before we made those changes is we had over 120,000, almost 150,000 bushels leave the state not the whole, some of it stayed in state, but most of that went to Maryland in a single calendar year. So that change that we made last year only allows 120,000 bushels maximum to leave in a single calendar year. So we don't have all 120,000 bushels caught in the spring, and then whatever the fall quota is, 40,000 bushels caught in the fall in a single year. So that's how that number there got so high. It was, they bought everything in the spring and then bought everything in the fall that same calendar year. So the change we made would prevent that from happening. And you can see when there isn't that out-of-state demand and there's not COVID-19, the domestic in-state demand has been in that 60 to 80,000 bushel range here recently. And again, the SMAC recommendation would be to talk about that again in April. Is that?
I think so.
Okay.
Yes. Is that a consensus?
I think that's, let me double check there, but I think that's everything that I had other than the other business that really is up for you all to discuss, and I'll try to answer questions if I can there.
All right, the other business, we have extending the patent tong season for, I think it's Deep Rock. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I'll turn that over to J.C.
Okay, guess I'm responsible for this. Yeah, Andrew, what we were looking at was after March 1st, until crab pot season starts on March 17th, it's roughly a little less than 3 weeks. It's really nothing for the watermen to do. If you don't participate in the menhaden gillnet fishery, there's a noticeable lull there. And I had several watermen came to me as being president of the Watermen's Association and asked my thoughts on if we could get an extension on patent tong season at Deep Rock. We know that the effort on Deep Rock this year and last year has been very, very low. This year, I've worked it the whole month of January and this whole month, and it's been 2 boats on Deep Rock and 2 boats on Beverly's, the whole between January and February. So the effort has not been there, and I know this is in code. I know now the season is set to close March 1st. And I know we do have a bill up in Richmond that hopefully, once it passes the House, this will go through in July. So what I was asking the commission on an emergency basis, if we could take a look at extending the patent tong season for 2 weeks on Deep Rock, if you would agree to it.
Well, I think it's been the position, we have an ask out to our legal advice about to confirm whether or not we can do that. I think the stance has been, I know there's a pending code change, but the stance has been that the season established by 282506 Code of Virginia for the patent tong areas has that March 1st deadline.
Okay.
And I'm not sure that we can legally do it, so I think we're exploring that this week. Is the best answer I can have for you, but I think.
If it is legal, would you support it?
Again, we want to discuss that with staff internally there, and it would really be a commission decision. And again, generally, we try to not have an emergency regulation to extend the season unless there's extenuating circumstances.
But isn't there a precedent? Didn't we extend the season last year for 15 days?
Yeah, I think there are reasons that we have done it in the past, but generally it was related to weather or ice or some other extenuating circumstances.
Not just because of lack of work. I got you. Okay.
I mean, that is an argument that can be made. There are, as Tommy mentioned last time, there are some economic arguments, but again, the case is stronger in the commission, and staff is more in support if there was extenuating circumstances beyond economics that prevented harvest.
Okay. Well, I just want to go on record that I asked for it, and I think we should do it, and now it's up to y'all.
Do you, what information do you have on the health of Deep Rock? Does it look, I know at the last meeting we were talking about James River and its decline in spat, smalls, and markers per meter. But what does Deep Rock look like? Do you know right offhand?
No, generally Deep Rock has been trending in a good direction. So there's higher market densities in small and spat, and it had a phenomenal spat set, I guess the year before last. A lot of those are now even market size. So most places, including Deep Rock, are in good condition. And again, I think JC is correct that there has been very light pressure this year, but I believe a lot of that pressure that was in Area 1, the Rappahannock, I think there's 20 or so boats out there now, so it is getting,
There's a few
it is
more
getting some
today.
work for the next 2 weeks here.
Yeah.
It's open.
Yeah, the only abnormality that I see on Deep Rock, and I talked this over with Ernie, and he's noticed it up in the Rappahannock too, the fossil shells. We're not getting any spat set on the fossil shells, and mainly because they're struck full of barnacles. I was gonna bring one to show you today, and I end up breaking it overboard, so I didn't bring it. But in certain areas where they congregate, you don't see any oysters, no spat set. It's just fossil shell with hundreds of barnacles on it. And I think they were probably planted in May or June at the height of the peak of the barnacle season. And they're probably struck, and you won't get spat set on that, they won't strike when there's that many barnacles on it. So I don't know, and I'm seeing it in a lot of areas there.
No, having a barnacle issue, it's hard to figure out the timing on that. And most of those shells were in late June, July, but in previous years, they've done great out there. But barnacles, I mean, they like oyster larvae, so if there's a lot of oyster larvae around, you get fat, happy barnacles. So.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Andrew, do we need to make a motion on that if we all for it, or
Andrew,
it would help to come before
the problem is, it's a statutory prohibition in March, is that right?
That's the position we've taken, yeah, and we're consulting legal counsel to make sure that with the code changes that are in place, but the code establishes March 1st as a closing date.
I mean,
For
I
patent
guess the commission's been mistaken for the last couple of years by running the season through March, is that right?
It may have been a stretch of what is in code there to have a patent tongue season past March 1st.
Yeah, I mean, the code is fairly clear. We have asked for some legal advice from the Attorney General's office to make sure we're interpreting this code section right. But basically, 28.2506 says the season for taking oysters by patent tongs from public oyster beds, rocks, or shoals shall be October 1 to March 1. The commission can set an alternate opening date as late as November 1st, but it doesn't ever mention anything about extending past March 1st. Now, we have allowed hand scrape and other activity. We've extended those seasons, but they're not patent tongue. So we think we're correct here interpreting that we can't really extend it, or we shouldn't, beyond that March 1st date. Of course, there is a bill right now in the General Assembly to change that, but that's not inactive yet. So, but we are checking with the Attorney General's office to make sure that both our regulatory authority, we're doing that correctly, and we're administering the law correctly. So at the moment, we think we can't really do it. We can't really do the patent tongue extension.
If we come back and we can extend the patent tongue season, which I'm certainly sympathetic to what J.C. and Ernie are saying, because they've done it for the last couple of years. But if they can extend it, then there's a possibility of looking at one of your less harvested areas in the Rappahannock to dredge for another 2 weeks. As far as you're looking at a 3-year rotation on the Rappahannock. You're looking at the highest level of oyster strike and oysters available that we've had for many, many years. You're looking at a healthy resource. Is there a way that we can give watermen work for 2 more weeks that wouldn't have it otherwise?
I'll let Andrew handle that. He's more the expert on the resource.
That's if you run into a roadblock on patent tongue on Deep Rock.
Well, I think staff's position would be similar to that in the James River, is that we took last season, is we would probably recommend not to extend the season. I mean, a lot can happen in 2 weeks, particularly if there's a standalone area. So if one area in the Rappahannock opens up and folks don't want to start rigging up and going crabbing on the 17th, and everyone wants to go oystering still, and the market demand, which I understand is very strong right there, the situation potentially could be the 60 boats that are there now stay, and another 60 boats come, and that's a lot of effort that can happen in 2 weeks. So that would be the concern about extending any of these hand scrape areas or dredge areas in general. And so we'd probably take that same position again.
Is this something we could address next year to make sure that we can have work for watermen until crabbing season starts, just as an option?
I think that by not extending it this season, that gives us many more options to work with next year. So I think that's something that we've done well as a committee and as a commission, is balancing that effort across the whole season by gear types, by areas. And again, the concern is that we limit our options for next season, and we might have more resource to address this if we don't potentially take that resource in this 2-week season now. So we could better, with more time and more planning, balance and adjust other areas to potentially allow more of a harvest at other points in the year. But again, you can only stretch the season so long and on each end, so it's hard to balance that out. But that's something that we do every year, as you know, when we develop the season in August that we all approve and recommend to the commission for approval, is try to balance that effort. And these emergency changes tend to kind of take all that work, and we just want, so that's the reason that staff generally doesn't support emergency extensions if there isn't any emergency other than an economic one.
Mr. Chairman?
Well, Andrew, that Deep Rock really needs working. I mean, it's a lot of, I'd say 80% of them snapping. And it really needs broken up a lot. And I don't think 2 weeks would hurt it, by no means. And I'd like to see the committee make a vote on it and see how we stand to bring forth to the meeting.
Yeah, I don't think we have to do a vote on it. I think we can have a general consensus that if there is a way that they can find to open this area until the 17th of March, when crabbing starts, that it be done. And I think, staff can look into that, and
I mean, the wellow's gonna take care of a lot of the, days you can work anyway,
You might get 7-8 days there,
up to 2 weeks.
Do you know when you'll hear back from your council? Will it be before March 1st?
I'm hoping that we hear back before the commission meets next Tuesday, because that would be sort of the last opportunity for an emergency regulation. So right now, I think we're limited by statute unless we're told otherwise. So that's why we can't really, I think that we pulled that advice from the SMAC because we were limited by statute last year. And I think there's a process in place to change that statute, but we'd be making a recommendation that right now we believe would be contrary to the law. So I don't know that we could do that.
Well, you don't know what the law is yet because you haven't heard back from your council.
Well, it's written in code.
Right, but
So we're clarifying it, yes.
You're clarifying. So I think what we're trying to get at is, can we say, if it is clarified by council, SMAC supports opening it for 2 more weeks?
Yeah.
And I'd like to make a motion or whatever I have to do for that.
I think we can just do it, a general, go ahead.
Is it too far of a stretch to have this code section made an emergency at the General Assembly? The governor could, there is a clause, they used it for the mask mandate yesterday, that once this passed, that it could be an emergency immediate. And this administration seems to be sympathetic to the economic situation with the watermen.
So here's my 2 cents worth, okay? I think we are sensitive to your request, and I would prefer that you do give us some direction, whether it's a consensus or a vote, because we can take that to the commission next week. We do hope to get some legal advice as soon as possible. We've got a request in. Our Kelsey Block is usually pretty receptive to answering our questions. To address Tommy's concern, yes, there is a bill, and yes, it could get passed and signed by the governor he can add emergency clause to make it effective immediately versus, and that would, I guess, answer the legal question, because if it passes and extends it through March, then I think it would be legally, it would be possible. The question still remains whether, we would want to recommend from a staff level extending it, and what the argument is, and whether that bill passes and what the language that goes around with that bill, why it passed. But anyway, so there's a lot of ifs, but we will do our best at staff level to get the legal question answered right now. We can't control what happens with this bill. That's outside of our scope and outside of what we can do.
And I don't think it would be possible to get that done before the commission meeting. if.
Oh, the bill, yeah, I doubt the bill would get through, but, I mean, it could happen before the end of March, because it'll be out by the middle of March, but, anyway, so that's just kind of my take on it. But you are an advisory board, and my position is, in this job that I have now, is we do want to take what y'all tell us to the commission, good, bad, or ugly. And we will try to relay it in as fair a way as we can, even if we don't agree with it at the staff level. You know, we don't think that, you know, it's the best thing to do from the resource protection, our side of the pie. So anyway, I understand there is definitely some, maybe consensus here, but I'd like to know what it is you really want us to go to the commission with. We'll work on the legal question part of it.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead.
Last point is, you know, this area is also limited by market for the resource, which has not been there. I don't know of too many people that would buy these oysters, and that opportunity is there now that throughout the season's normally not there. So that, you know, that's one protection, and I would make a motion that SMAC request a 15-day extension in the Deep Rock Patentong area. And I would also ask that the commission be made aware that we've done this, and I can't quote the number, it's either 3 or 4 times. Obviously we could look that up, but it's for patentonging in Area 1 or Deep Rock, so it's not something that we're asking to do that's never been done before. But so I guess my motion is to ask for it to be extended for 2 weeks, and that I would ask staff to consider making the hard sell on precedent as to why regulation should cover this. If the AG says no, so be it, but there's precedent for it.
I have a motion.
I'll second it.
I'll third.
Got a second and a third, there you go. Any more discussion?
I'd like to make a comment that maybe next year in August or September, when we set the season for 22 and 23, that maybe we can plan to have a resource open for crabbers until March 17th, just to plan, so we're not planning at the end of the season, we're planning at the beginning of the season for something like that.
Mr. May.
Yeah. I wonder if I could make a comment about the seed situation.
Yes.
All right. Andrew, I'm not going to steal your thunder. I'm Roger Mann, all of you know me. I've been standing there talking about oysters for 35 years now, and I must say, what I've heard tonight is one of the most encouraging situations with seed that I've heard in half a lifetime. I applaud the conversation that we had about seed and how we use them tonight, and especially the gentleman at this end of the group who talk about the needs to make sure that we have work for the watermen and that we should be looking at these as economic exercises. Now, I've often been sort of, cast here as the conservative guy who comes in and pours cold water on every warm idea. When I look at these numbers up here, the thing that's worried me a lot and the thing that I harass Andrew about is the state of the shell, because when you harvest seed, you harvest shell, and we've spent an awful lot of time and an awful lot of money getting the shell back to what's in that graph up there, and I think that that is really something that you should take pride in. Looking forward from the conversations that you've had tonight about how do we get the most economic return for the Commonwealth out of this, and with all due respect to my colleagues north of the state line who manage their oyster resource into, well, you can fill in the rest of that conversation, they do have a lot of money. I personally would be really upset if we ever got to the point where it was an open market, where our seed went out of state, because one of the things that I've heard in this conversation here tonight is what can we do with the seed in state for the resource, for the watermen, for the buyers, and for the economic return. And what you touched on was about 5% of that. If you think of all of the options that you have with a healthy seed resource that we manage so that we can harvest it and not, cruelly destroy the substrate underneath, in terms of what you can do for planting that in places to build up the public industry, and I include our friends in the Potomac for that. but also what you can do in terms of, putting it out to the people who have their own leases and whatever. There's an awful lot of options that you see in these graphs that are becoming available that 5 to 10 years ago were a pipe dream. Now, if you look at all of those in terms of if we take this much out of this river and we put it in the river, what do we think we're going to get in terms of bushels back of it? And it's always the famous one. If you plant a bushel and you get a bushel back, you're doing okay. You'd really like 2. If you get 3, you jump up and down. In these data sets that we have here for the last 10, 15, 20 years, really since the end of 2006, 2007, where we saw the effects of the diseases go away, one of the things I've been doing for the last 6 months is trying to make head and tail of how all these trends go. And some of those transitions now, I think we can make forward projections on what we would expect to come out of them in harvest. I wouldn't have stood up here 5 years ago and said that we could do that. Those are really positive options that we should be thinking about in terms of how we do management, because if you can do the forward projections, you can talk about how many mandates you're going to get out there on the water, and you can talk about how much money is going to come back into the Commonwealth in terms of revenues. I think that's a doable thing to do in terms of a list of opportunities that you can talk about. Now, we're not going to do it in this season, and we're not going to do it before the commission meeting. But there's a certain part of this that I can bring to this, that Andrew can bring to this, and the other part of it is what you guys bring to it in terms of your experience in how well you can transfer this stuff, how you plant it, and what you get back for it. Now, I don't want to get into your bank accounts. That's your situation. But I think that what these graphs tell us, and the nature of the conversation that we've had here tonight, I think doing something like that over the next year is a real possibility. And we've not had that opportunity before. We've sat here and we've argued about me arguing about the stock assessment and you wanting the economics. That's fine. That's what we should be debating. The point is, though, is that I think with the state of the seed resource and where we are with our ability to do something in areas where the substrate is not going to disappear through the bottom, we can look at a matrix of ideas, we can look at a whole bunch of opportunities and ask what will we think is going to be the best if and when this happens. And it would be nice, like the guys who went and stood on the sidelines at the Super Bowl and called the plays, if we had a playbook. We've never had a playbook. I think we can go a long way in the next year towards developing one. And again, I don't want to use it just to block out our colleagues north of the state line, but quite frankly, it's Virginia money and Virginia effort that's been put into building this, and we ought to have a playbook for us. So, there's an offer for you. I don't know if I've just jumped into the deep end with concrete socks, but I think it's worth something that we should talk about. So, gentlemen, I applaud what you've done this evening, and to the lady on the phone, I applaud what you've done as well. We are in a better place now than we've been for a long time. And it's not often I get up and say that. Thank you.
Mr. Mann?
Yeah.
While you're up here, I have a question for you. Some years back, I listened to one of your presentations, and you talked about that if oyster shell never decayed, there would be a land bridge.
There would.
Around the, and I know I'm not going to put you on the spot for tonight, but it would I think it'd be good for the committee to see your thoughts on how much that could have played into what's going on in the James River and the sanctuary.
The sanctuary in particular, what I'd like to see is the side scan images that have come through there. Most people have looked at side scan images. You can see dredge tracks. If there are dredge tracks through it, I think we all need to sort of look upon it to ask who made them, how many of them were, and do they relate to what we've seen missing. Substrate doesn't just evaporate, but it goes away over time. And I will state publicly that I'm probably one of the fiercest critics of a lot of the restoration work that goes on in the bay. Not because I don't think it's well-intentioned. I think one of the great challenges that you have, if you think about how an oyster reef works, and has worked for 60 million years, you have to have the reef going up, not the reef going down. If you lose stuff off the top from harvest, you can lose a small amount. If you lose a lot of it from disease, you can lose a lot of amount. But the purpose is that shell continually goes away, whether you're harvesting it or not. Ask Lake and these gentlemen how much money they've spent on planting shell over the years, and it'll give you an eye-watering heartburn. the point is that in these restoration projects, what you need to do is to get enough shell to produced by these animals that are living and dying so that you don't keep having to go back and put shell on top of them. Now, years ago when I went to Louisiana, I had a conversation with a man who was in the business of restoring plantations. I said, are you just painting it or are you restoring it? Because if you restore it, once you walk away from it, it's going to look like this for 50 years and you'll never have to touch it. If you have to come back and fix it every year, you're not restoring it. One of the great challenges that you have when you get into this shell planting and reef building business is making the thing self-sustaining. Now, I could bore you all with the math of how this works. And there's a lot of people who don't like me because I've got up and I've done this math in public. And it can be potentially quite embarrassing. It's getting better. But really what you need to do to make restoration work is you need lots of big old oysters to die to make up for the loss. And if you look at the stuff that's come out today, from the last estimations, between now and 2050, sea level's going to go up anywhere between 7 and 8 inches. That is really scary. And if you think about this over the last 10, 15, 20,000 years, you have these sea level rates that go up at twice, 3 times the current rate. The current rate is about that much per year. In September, we were out on a boat actually doing work for surf clams, and we came across some old oyster reefs. The oysters out there are this big and they're this thick and they're probably 25 years old, and the nature of the way in which they grow, they produce reefs that are full of big old animals. If you ever look at fossil shell, you planted it. What's the thing that's striking about it? There are no small oysters in it. It's the big ones that die and live and form the reefs. And so, part of the challenge that you have when you get into this replenishment versus the restoration thing is, can you actually get the stuff to hang around long enough to become self-repleting? And what is it we've spent in the Bay over the last 5 years? $20, $30 million? 10 years from now, we're going to find out whether or not it works if they leave it alone. 10 years from now, I don't know if I'll be standing up, never alone standing here. I turn 70 in a few weeks. But it's a challenge when you look at that. I think when we look at this in terms of what we're doing in terms of managing shell, I think all of you should deserve congratulations for this, and this man should as well, because if you look back at the work that he and Dr. Wesson did, it's really good. And it is for the first time in 30 years allowed me to get up and have this conversation with you about having a playbook. I'd like not to put us in the situation where we get carried away with it and give away all of the points in the last quarter to our colleagues in Maryland and everywhere else. But I'm still skeptical. It's good to have a skeptic every now and again because it keeps you honest.
So would you say that 10 bushels or 10 liters
that thick?
At that point, the rock can continue to grow, but any less than that, we need to take action to keep it from further
Well, if you
depleting?
think about it, if your oyster shell layer is this thick all the way across the bottom, are you worried about it getting critical? Because that's what 10 liters per square meter is. And, again, to come back to the fact that we do use GW, we use a different tong. And we do it for a particular reason. I mean, you guys don't want to spend your life digging through all the shell underneath. Actually, I do, because I want to know how much shell there is underneath it so that we can do these sorts of calculations. And so, if any of you are daft enough or want to waste a day coming out with us, we'd be happy to show you what it is we do for any of you who are interested. Gentlemen, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Mann.
Roger.
Roger, all right.
How many times have
Anything else?
Not unless there's any other questions there.
Yeah,
but,
I was
We need
just
to
gonna
vote
add.
on that motion.
No.
Did we have a motion we need to vote on?
Yes.
That was the extension. All right, let's have a motion on the extension of the Pat Tong season. Till when? The 15th, you said?
Till the 15th.
Aye.
Aye.
Dan?
He hung up.
They might be calling. Anybody left on the phones?
Yeah, this is Jackie. I'm abstaining for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Aye from Beverly.
All right, and chair votes aye as well. Looks like the motion passes. Thank you all. And I guess I'll ask everybody that's attended tonight, does anybody else have any other business they'd like to bring up? Seeing none, I'd like to thank you all for your comments and your participation and your interest. And thank Andrew and all of the staff here for all your help. Anything else, Andrew?
I don't think so. Thank you all for your time and extended meeting here, so I much appreciate it. Thank you.
I appreciate the commissioner being here. I think that's the first time I've seen that, so I appreciate that.
Motion to adjourn. All right. We are adjourned.